Sidney Cook is a British convicted rapist and suspected serial killer, currently serving a life sentence for horrific crimes against children in the 1970s. However, these offences are just the tip of the iceberg. Cook was a prolific predator who abused children from the 1960s until the 1980s and was the head of a group of paedophiles known in the press as the Dirty Dozen. These men abducted, raped and killed male children. Cook is one of the most remorseless, depraved and disgusting offenders in UK criminal history, who, at the age of 95, is also one of the oldest serving prisoners in Britain. Welcome to Evil Among Us.
Sidney Charles Cook was born on the 18th of April 1927 in Stroud in the county of Gloucestershire. Little is known about Cook's childhood, but he later claimed in court that he was sexually abused as a child. This may have been his way of trying to gain sympathy from the judge and portray himself as a victim, or it may indeed be true.
But it's no excuse for anything that he did as an adult. In August 1945, Cook joined the British Army, but was a terrible soldier, and he was frequently AWOL and served several prison sentences for this. He was eventually kicked out of the army in 1952, spending most of his time either on the run or behind bars, rather than serving king and country. In the early 1960s, Cook found work as a fairground worker, which would enable him to travel around the country, interact with children, and eventually target them without suspicion. Cook specifically manned a test your strength machine, which was popular with young boys keen to show off. When Cook began sexually abusing children is unclear, but in 1961, he was given a £20 fine for molesting a boy in a cinema. Cook's next confirmed victims were two brothers, with the youngest being 10 and the elder one being around 11 or 12. They both came from an abusive household, where there were 9 children in total, with their father being described as an alcoholic, violent bully, and their mother being unable to care for the children. Cook came across the family whilst working at a fairground in 1970, and it appears that this family may also have been from this community, as the offences he committed were across various areas, indicating this family moved around frequently. The youngest boy was abused by Cook for approximately 5 years from the age of 13 years old, being anally raped, as well as being forced to perform oral sex on Cook, whilst also having him engage in this behaviour on him. The older brother was molested at the same time as his sibling for around 4 years and threatened with violence if he didn't comply. On some occasions, the boys would be taken together to an allotment and sexually assaulted by Cook and a friend of his. Remember these offences, as they'll be important later. How many children Cook molested during the 1970s is unclear, as he targeted disadvantaged families and children from backgrounds of abuse where he could easily integrate himself, molest the children, and then, when the fairground moved on, simply up sticks and set up in another area. Cook, like other serial offenders, was able to take advantage of this nomadic lifestyle. It is known to have moved around England, both north and south, going between Oxfordshire, London, Kent, Hertfordshire and Tyne and Wear. It appears that Cook would frequently offend with his associates, who also had a sexual attraction to boys, and as time progressed, the number of people linked to this behaviour increased to the point where there were around 12 paedophiles who would engage in these offences, and they became known as the Dirty Dozen. Sometimes there are more than 12, sometimes less, but there appears to have been a core of dedicated and prolific paedophiles led by Sidney Cook, which included the following monsters. Leslie Bailey, known as Catweasel, due to his staring eyes which resembled the title character of the British children's TV series of the same name, was born on the 21st of June 1953 in Hackney in London. He had below average intelligence and spent the majority of his childhood in care. In 1973, Bailey sexually assaulted and attempted to murder a 7-year-old girl. For some reason, the charges were reduced and he spent just 5 months in a mental hospital. In 1979, Bailey followed a woman into a lift in a block of flats, beat her and anally raped her. He was sent to prison for 5 years for this attack, being released in around 1982. Robert Oliver was born in around 1955. His mother apparently hated the fact that she had a son, and so dressed him up in women's clothing. By the age of 14 years old, Oliver would spend most of his time at arcades, where he'd be taken advantage of by men who would give him money for sex. Lenny Smith was born in Wales on the 23rd of August 1954. He too spent much of his childhood in care and was known to be the victim of sexual violence, but also the instigator of this type of behaviour. He was the victim due to his time working as a male prostitute in London, but he would also pimp out other young men and children. Smith met Robert Oliver in around 1973. However, it's not clear when he met Sidney Cook. In 1977, Smith was sent to prison for a year for gross indecency with a child. Aside from the link between Lenny Smith and Robert Oliver, it's difficult to establish when and how these four men met each other. However, regardless of how they met, between around the late 1970s and the 1980s, these men would take the lead in travelling around the country, abducting young boys off the street or hiring child prostitutes, at which point they'd be drugged, held whilst other paedophiles were gathered, and then gang raped. Due to the lack of DNA evidence back in the 1970s and the early 80s, the nomadic behaviour of these men, and the vulnerability of their victims, the number of children abused by this paedophile ring has never been established. Similarly, we don't know how many children these men murdered. Conservatively, it's believed they gang raped upwards of 50 children, although this is likely to be a significant underestimation. With regards to children they murdered, this figure varies wildly depending on sources, but could be anywhere from 7 to 20. The deaths of only 3 children ever led to any charges against these men, with Cook, the leader of the group, only being convicted of offences related to one of them. On the 1st of June 1984, 7-year-old Mark Tildesley met a man on the street where he lived in Wokingham in Berkshire, who took him to a sweet shop and bought him a bag of sweets. This man was Sidney Cook, and the shopkeeper heard Cook saying that he would pay for Mark to go on the dodgems that night. Cook was working at a local fairground, having set up his test of strength machine there. After finishing his dinner at 5:30, Mark left his home and rode his bike to the fairground. Before he left, his mother told him to be home no later than 7:30, and he said to her, quote, "Don't worry, Mum, I won't be late." These were his last words to her. It appears that by this point, Cook had already set his plan into motion, with him calling Leslie Bailey, and he and Lenny Smith travelled from London to Wokingham to attend a, quote, party that evening. When they got to the fun fair, they met Cook, who had lured Mark away from the main site on the promise of buying him sweets. It appears that Mark was becoming scared, and he resisted, and he had to be picked up and forced into the car and driven to Cook's caravan a short distance away. They then met with another paedophile, known only as Oddbod, at the caravan. Once inside, Mark was given a glass of milk laced with muscle relaxant before being raped by all 4 men. More muscle relaxant was poured down his throat, and he was gang raped again. At some point, it was noticed that Mark was dead, but Cook said he was just unconscious and returned him to the site of the abduction. The other men left, leaving Cook alone with Mark's dead body. Cook then disposed of Mark's remains, likely burying it somewhere known only to him, and, to the present day, he's never revealed where this poor child's remains are. When Mark didn't return home at 7:30, an extensive search was started, but no trace of Mark could be found. Unfortunately, it appears that he was already dead by this point, so before his parents even knew he was missing. Mark's father John passed away in 2005, and his mother Lavinia in 2011, with both parents dying before they could lay their boys to rest. On the 15th of September 1985, 6-year-old Barry Lewis was outside playing with his friends when he left and began to walk the short distance to his home in Woolworth, in South London. He never made it home. Barry was abducted by force or lured into a vehicle. It's important to point out at this point that by the early 1980s, the paedophile group led by Cook had obtained a flat, although I've read somewhere there might have been 2, in the Kingsmead estate in Hackney, East London. The flat I found information about was described as squalid and disgusting, and, whilst people did live there, the main purpose was to have a place where children could be drugged and gang raped. The lead tenant at the property and the main person who lived there was Lenny Smith. Sidney Cook was living a short distance away in another flat in Hackney. All through the early 1980s, there were sexual attacks on children in the area, likely all committed by members of this group. It's to this address that Barry was likely taken after being abducted. Here he was drugged, stripped, and anally raped by 7 or 8 men, including Sidney Cook, Robert Oliver, Leslie Bailey, and likely Lenny Smith. Bay was left covered in blood by this ordeal and was believed to have been dead. He remained in the flat until the next day, when Bailey was tasked with disposing of the boy's body. As he was driving towards the county of Essex, northeast of London, Barry stirred, and it was clear that he was still alive. Bailey then strangled Barry, and, when he was sure he was dead, dumped his body in a field in Essex, approximately 30 miles from the site of his original abduction. His body was not found until the 5th of December 1985, almost 3 months after his abduction. Jason Swift had an extremely difficult life. He was born in March 1971 in Warwickshire, in the Midlands, as one of 5 siblings. The family lived in poverty, and, due to the level of neglect in the household, Jason and his siblings were taken into care. Jason's short life was characterised by moving from place to place, from care home to care home. He also had learning difficulties, meaning he needed to attend a special school. He was described as being both quiet and withdrawn. Jason was once asked by a psychologist if he had 3 wishes, what would he ask for? He stated, quote, money, a house, and food. By late 1985, aged just 14, Jason was in London and had, for some time, been travelling around the city, going to public toilets where men would take advantage of him and pay him money or give him food in exchange for sexual services. He's also thought to have been a regular visitor to the Kingsmead estate in Hackney, and evidence was later revealed that he appears to have known Lenny Smith and was seen going in and out of his flat dozens of times in the months prior to his murder. The exact date of Jason's death is unknown, but it's believed that he was murdered on the 27th of November 1985. It's also not clear how he ended up in the flat on the Kingsmead estate, whether he was there willingly or had been abducted and taken there. However, what is known is that Sidney Cook had arranged for at least 6, but likely many more men, to pay him £5 to anally rape Jason. This included Cook himself, but also Leslie Bailey, Robert Oliver, and inevitably Lenny Smith. Jason was drugged and raped for hours, and at some point during this ordeal he died, likely by being suffocated, with something being placed over his nose and mouth deliberately. Jason's body was then taken and dumped in a copse near a place called Stapleford Tawney in Essex, approximately 20 miles away from the site of his murder, where it was discovered on the 30th of November 1985 by a farm worker. Although he was killed after Barry Lewis, Jason's body was recovered 5 days beforehand, and the deposition sites were around 10 miles apart. Autopsies on the bodies of both Jason Swift and Barry Lewis show police that both had sustained horrific injuries from being raped by multiple men, showing them not after one man, but a group of men. Also, it was clear around the same time, in the same area, men were offering their services as babysitters in order to gain access to children to rape, and this included Leslie Bailey, Robert Oliver, and Lenny Smith. In January 1986, the police therefore began a task force investigating the offence of this paedophile ring. Over the course of 1986 and 1987, the police interviewed thousands of witnesses and people of interest and compiled thousands of pages of evidence and intelligence. As time progressed, each of the main group members was arrested. Initially, they were detained for various sex offences, and this included Sidney Cook and Lenny Smith, who were both arrested in February 1986, related to the sexual assault of a 13-year-old boy. Whilst in prison on remand for this offence, Cook would boast about raping children and the murder of Jason Swift. He would go into graphic detail about raping and killing boys, with him saying he killed many of them. The prisoners were so disgusted that they contacted the police to tell them what they'd learnt. In June 1987, Robert Oliver was arrested and charged with abusing children whilst posing as a babysitter. Oliver was questioned about the death of Jason Swift and confessed that he knew him through Cook and Smith, therefore forming the link between them. In July 1987, Leslie Bailey was arrested and soon confessed to being present on the day that Jason died, raping him and being complicit in his death. He named all of the men that were present. This same month, Sidney Cook was confronted with all the evidence whilst in prison, and he admitted raping Jason, but claimed that he'd simply been invited to a, quote, gangbang, organised by someone else and he was not responsible for his death. He said that Lenny Smith had brought Jason to the property originally. By 1988, enough evidence had been obtained to charge all 4 men with raping and murdering Jason Swift. Unfortunately, by the time of the trial in 1989, charges against Lenny Smith had been dropped due to lack of evidence. It's really unclear why this happened, as there were multiple witnesses who saw Jason going in and out of his property in the months before he died. Bailey and Cook had also admitted he was there and involved, and Cook even said he was the one who brought Jason to the property. As if this wasn't worse enough, after long, quote, legal arguments, the charge of murder was dropped and replaced by one of manslaughter, so acknowledging that Jason had died during the sexual assault on him, but this was not deliberate, and that he'd been suffocated accidentally during this abuse. The men were convicted on this basis. On the 12th of May 1989, the men were sentenced. Sidney Cook was sentenced to 19 years in prison. Leslie Bailey was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Robert Oliver was also sentenced to 15 years in prison. The police continued to investigate the abduction, rape and murder of children. In 1990, Leslie Bailey confessed to police that he'd raped and murdered Barry Lewis, and that he'd raped Mark Tildesley, and was therefore involved in the incident which had led to his death. He gave detailed confessions about who was involved in these crimes, as well as outlining multiple other offences committed by the group. He stated there were at least 8 burial sites dotted around the south of England where victims were buried, but was vague with the details, and none of these sites were located. It appears that in May 1991, the police began a series of 64 interviews with Sidney Cook whilst he was in prison. During these interactions, he apparently went into minute detail about raping Barry Lewis, clearly taking great glee in reliving the experience. However, despite Leslie Bailey's confession and Cook's admission, no one else was charged with these murders, which seems absolutely ridiculous to me. What led to this decision was the fact that Leslie Bailey had significant underlying cognitive and emotional issues, and this, coupled with the fact that he was a child rapist, meant he was not considered a credible witness. In addition to this, Cook subsequently withdrew his confession to raping Barry, and there was little other evidence, so there was not enough to charge anyone else with the offences related to Mark and Barry. So Bailey stood alone in the dock when on the 14th of June 1991, he pleaded guilty to murdering and raping Barry Lewis, and on the 22nd of October 1992, he pleaded guilty to the manslaughter and rape of Mark Tildesley. Leslie Bailey was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes, but I don't have any information about how long he was meant to serve before he could apply for parole. However, it doesn't matter, as Bailey would never see freedom again, and his time in prison was short. On October the 7th, 1993, he was found dead in his cell at H&P Whitemoor, a Category A prison in Cambridgeshire. He'd been murdered, strangled to death by 2 inmates as retribution for his crimes. Before turning to what has become of Sidney Cook, I want to look at the fates of the other men involved in this case. It's clear that Lenny Smith essentially escaped justice for his part in the murders of children. However, he did not ride off into the sunset. A prolific and dangerous sex offender, he was eventually sent to prison for 10 years in 1992 for a string of horrific sex offences against a 6-year-old boy he was babysitting. He was released from prison in June 1999, but requested to be placed in a secure housing block for offenders next to Nottingham Prison. It appears this was a housing block where serious offenders would go to before moving on to another property, but Smith never left there. It seems that the crimes of the Dirty Dozen had been well publicised by this point, and the community was in uproar about any of these men ever seeing freedom again. Smith likely knew that if he stepped out into the real world, he would be murdered. This was a well-founded concern, given that Leslie Bailey had already been murdered, but also a man named Bill Malcolm was murdered in February 2000. He was living in a property in East London when someone knocked on the door. When he opened it, he was shot at point-blank range in the head. Malcolm was an associate of the Dirty Dozen, but I'm unsure exactly what offences he was involved in with them. However, his record is described as appalling in and of itself, and it included him raping a 6-year-old girl. Then, when he was released from prison, tracking her down and raping her again, while saying, quote, "You put me away, you bitch." It's believed this was an organised hit by gangs who felt he deserved to die for his crimes. No one mourned his passing. So Lenny Smith, likely fearing he would suffer the same fate, lived in this property attached to the prison, apparently leaving only once or twice for 7 years until his death from AIDS in 2006. Robert Oliver served his original sentence and was released, apparently changing his name. Due to his crimes, he was required to register as a sex offender and have restrictions about having contact with children, i.e. he shouldn't have any at all ever. In July 2013, he was jailed for 3 years for breaching these conditions, as he'd apparently gone into a household with children and sent a birthday card to a 1-year-old. He was released in 2014 and is apparently still alive, but probably with a new name. So what became of Sidney Cook? Sickeningly, his sentence of 19 years was reduced by the Court of Appeal to 16 years in 1992, as he was able to argue that, due to Leslie Bailey's confessions, he must have been the leader of the group. He was just following. Why this made a difference, I do not know. However, the police knew that he was the ringleader. This meant that Cook would be released in 1998. During his time in prison, Cook showed no remorse and refused to undertake any rehabilitation programs. In fact, he revelled in his offending and was seen as a celebrity by other paedophiles. He would describe in graphic detail how he'd raped and murdered children, claiming he killed between 15 and 20. The public was well aware of how dangerous Cook was, and so, when he was released on the 6th of April 1998, they were waiting for him. Despite changing his name to Sidney Lomas, Cook was easily recognisable, and it was clear that if someone got their hands on him, they would tear him limb from limb. Cook was housed at Yeovil Police Station in Somerset for his own protection and stayed there for 9 months, not leaving the premises. The police knew they had an extremely dangerous child rapist and murderer now released. It was only a matter of time until he began offending. They needed something, anything, to hang on him, to get him off the streets forever. Luckily, they got a break. They were able to obtain statements from the 2 brothers I mentioned at the beginning of the video, who Cook abused for years in the 1970s. Based on this, on the 20th of April 1999, just over a year after his release, Sidney Cook was charged with 18 sexual offences against these children, including rape and sexual assault. During his police interview, he admitted the offences, and showing his disgusting, distorted thinking, he told the officers that the reason why he'd performed oral sex on one of the boys, after he'd forced this child to do this to him, was because, quote, "he gave me entertainment, and I returned the compliment." Sidney Cook was remanded into custody after being arrested, and on the 17th of December 1999, he appeared at Wolverhampton Crown Court before Judge David Poole for sentencing, having pleaded guilty to the offences for which he was charged. Judge Poole stated, quote, "The reports before me are unanimous, that notwithstanding your advancing years, you remain for the time being, and will remain for an incalculable period, a serious danger to children." He then sentenced him. Sidney Cook was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 5 years before he could apply for parole. Sidney Cook has been eligible to apply for parole from around 2004, and at the time of recording, this has been refused 10 times, most recently in October 2021. He was back in the papers again in October 2022, when a story appeared about him making an appeal to get his freedom. Obviously, a story like this produces panic, and I sometimes wonder whether the authors are just ignorant of how things work, or know and just want to be sensationalist. Basically, prisoners on life sentences can apply for parole at regular intervals. This is reviewed by the parole board. This happens maybe once a year or once every 2 years. The parole board can decide to release them back into the world, move them to open conditions, which is a less restrictive environment, or refuse either of these 2 things. Cook has been denied either release or a move to open prisons since he first became eligible for parole and remains in the Monster Mansion, H&P Wakefield, a Category A prison which houses some of the country's most dangerous offenders. The fact he still remains in this environment and has not been moved to a lower security prison for his entire time in custody shows what the authorities think of him. Sidney Cook can apply for release until the cows come home, but he'll never be released. And, at the age of 95, he's hopefully coming to the end of his miserable life, and the next headline will be about his death. Sidney Cook is one of the most prolific and remorseless child sex offenders and murderers the UK has ever seen, and that is just what we know. Unfortunately, Cook committed his offences at a time when there were no CCTV cameras, and our understanding of DNA was still in its infancy. He was a calculating and predatory sex offender, travelling the length and breadth of the country abusing children. I've no doubt that he specifically chose working at a fairground, knowing this would attract little boys who he could then abuse before packing up and moving on to a new site quickly without anyone batting an eyelid. His type of victim was not arbitrary either. Cook targeted children he knew had fallen through the cracks in society, like Jason Swift, a lost young man who was already being abused by predatory men when all he wanted was a roof over his head and food in his belly. Sidney Cook is a man who devoted his whole life to the abuse of children. He was inevitably a sexual psychopath. I've no doubt that he got sexual gratification from him and the screams of his victims. He also saw that he could make money from this, and so got men to pay him to rape the children he obtained. The men who he committed these offences with were no less evil. All of them were deeply disturbed, horrific excuses for human beings. Together, these men, and all of the others involved, formed an unholy alliance intent on meeting their disgusting sexual need to abuse young boys, destroying their bodies, and for those they did not kill, inflicting wounds so deep psychologically and emotionally that I wouldn't be surprised if some of the people they abused and let live committed suicide afterwards, or struggled with being able to cope in their life until this very day. People who victimise children are cowards, pure and simple, but Cook existed in a world surrounded by pathetic cowards. He gained a sense of celebrity from these pathetic sycophants. All through his time in prison, it appears he wanted recognition and praise for the things he had done. I've read that Cook is a remorseless and arrogant man, and imagine that if you sat down with him, he would sit there with a smirk on his face, just asking for a kicking. The most heartbreaking part of this story is just how little we know about the crimes of Cook and the so-called Dirty Dozen. Several men I haven't mentioned were convicted of their part in this paedophile ring, but the majority were never identified and never prosecuted. This lack of knowledge also means the identities of all the children they murdered will never be known. Each one of these victims represents a life that was snatched away before it even begun, but also a family who never knew what happened to their loved one, or, even worse, because of the type of children he targeted, some may never have been reported missing. Their disappearances may not have even been noticed. I hope that all of the children who died at the hands of Sidney Cook and his disgusting band of paedophiles are at peace, and the ones that survived have been able to rebuild their lives despite what these monsters did to them. Reynard Sanaga is the most prolific convicted rapist in UK criminal history, with him estimated to have raped and sexually assaulted at least 200 men between 2015 and 2017. Sanaga would stalk the streets of Manchester, UK, looking for victims who he would lure into his property and then assault them, with him filming his sickening crimes. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Reynard Sanaga was born on the 19th of February 1983 in Jambi, on the island of Sumatra, Indonesia. He was from a privileged upbringing, with his father being involved in banking. The family were wealthy, and Sanaga grew up not wanting for anything. Sanaga was raised Catholic, and appears to have hidden the fact that he was gay from his parents, who wanted him to marry a woman and settle down and start a family. After completing a degree in architecture at the University of Indonesia in 2006, Sanaga moved to the UK in 2007 to begin to study for a master's degree in planning at the University of Manchester, which he completed in 2009, followed by him studying for a Master of Arts in Sociology, which he achieved in 2011. He then remained living in Manchester, and in 2012 he began to study for his doctorate degree in human geography, with him working on his thesis at the time of his arrest in 2017. During his time in the UK, Sinago lived openly as a gay man and was sexually promiscuous. He would, however, change completely when his parents came to visit or when he would return home to Indonesia, with them apparently having no idea of his sexual orientation until his trial. Sinago's base for his attacks was a flat in Princes Street, Manchester, right in the heart of the city and at the centre of the nightlife. His road was somewhere that people staggering home from a night out would pass by. People who met Sinaga saw an unassuming, 5'7", bespectacled, thin man. His social media presence showed the face he wished to portray to others. There were people who identified issues with him, which we'll return to later, but everyone who knew him was shocked by the monster he truly was. This would only be revealed in 2017, when its rampage was finally brought to an end by the police. In order to outline the horror in this case, it's necessary to start at the end and see how the offences of Sinaga came to light, which began with one phone call to the police on the 2nd of June 2017. On this date, the police received a phone call from a 21-year-old rugby player who stated that Sinaga had tried to rape him. This man said that he'd been on his way home from a night out when Sinaga had ushered him into his property. In his intoxicated state, the man agreed. Sinaga then tried to drug this man and was trying to rape him when he woke up, and he managed to fight him off. Sinaga was no match for a rugby player and, to put it mildly, he had the shit kicked out of him. The police attended and found Sinaga barely conscious on the floor, and initially they arrested the rugby player for causing grievous bodily harm, but they were suspicious of Sinaga and accompanied him to the hospital where he was chained to the bed. They seized his mobile phone from the property and demanded the PIN number from him. Sinaga initially gave the wrong PIN number, but eventually gave the right one, and the police officers were confronted with the video of Sinaga attacking the rugby player, which showed, unfortunately, that this individual had already been raped before he came to. Sinaga was arrested in the hospital bed for a single count of rape, but this was just the tip of the iceberg. Police returned to Sinaga's property and recovered dozens of phones, driving licenses, student IDs, wallets, watches, and Facebook screen grabs of men. All of these men were those that Sinaga had raped, and these were his trophies of his crimes. The true horror, though, was found on the phone the police had taken initially, and on this phone was hundreds of hours of Sinaga raping and sexually assaulting men. Sinaga anally raped almost all of his victims and would ejaculate both inside them and on their bodies. He used a condom during only one of his attacks, and, by some miracle, is not known to have infected any of his victims. This is based on the fact that he tested negative for all sexually transmitted diseases upon his arrest. This, of course, doesn't discount that he previously had an STD and then got it treated. He would also kiss his victims' bodies and on their mouths. Most of his victims were raped repeatedly over a number of hours. I feel sorry for the police officers who had to watch each and every one of these sickening videos. CCTV analysis and inquiries showed Sinaga's modus operandi, with him leaving his property late at night and trawling the local streets looking for lone, intoxicated men, who he then manipulated into coming back to his flat. This was by a number of ways, including giving them a safe space to sleep off their intoxication, ordering a taxi, or inviting them back to his flat for more drinks. Unfortunately, when we're drunk, we make bad decisions, and in this state, it may have seemed like a good idea to go with this unassuming, physically slight man for whatever reasons. This CCTV footage shows Sinaga going on the prowl for a victim.
When they got into the flat,
Sanaga would offer them a drink, spiked with the drug gamma hydroxybutyric acid, more commonly known as GHB. GHB is a drug actually used to treat sleep disorders and anxiety, and it acts by relaxing the nervous system. However, in large enough doses, it can cause unconsciousness, confusion, and memory loss. When the men were unconscious, Sanaga would rape them, filming his sickening crimes, clearly for his own sexual gratification at a later date. Police inquiries established that the first attack they could prove was on New Year's Day 2015, when a man was out for a night out, and the next thing he remembered was coming to, covered in vomit in Sanaga's flat, with no idea how he got there. Sanaga feigned concern and gave some story about this victim being too drunk to get home, and he gave him a place to stay. The victim actually apologized to Sanaga and went on his way, not knowing until 2 years later that he had been raped. Sanaga's thoughts would prowl the streets most nights and committed several rapes per month. The police had the heartbreaking task of informing the victims of his offences. Using Sanaga's trophies and the content of the videos, they were able to identify 48 victims who they had to contact individually and inform them that they had been raped. Almost all of them had no idea that anything had happened to them, and the bottom of their world must have dropped out. However, at least 60 victims could not be identified. Forensic analysis and detailed police work led to Sanaga being suspected of raping at least 206 men between January 2015 and his arrest in 2017. Let that number sink in. At least 206 men raped by this man in a 2.5-year period. Sanaga's method did not change, and he simply gave some sort of excuse when these people woke up to explain their presence in his flat, with him knowing full well they couldn't actually remember the true horror of their experience. Some people may be questioning why no one reported his behaviour to the police or suspected they had been raped. The unfortunate truth is that I believe that some of them probably did suspect they'd been raped, but there's such a stigma about male sexual assault that they probably felt so ashamed, so violated and so dirty that they didn't want to admit to themselves or others what had happened. However, as will be illustrated later, a lot of his victims showed extraordinary bravery later on in court. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Sanaga pleaded not guilty to all charges, and there were 4 trials. Between the 1st of June 2018 and the 10th of July 2018, for crimes against 13 victims. Between the 1st of April 2019 and the 7th of May 2019, for crimes against 12 victims. Between the 16th of September 2019 and the 4th of October 2019, related to 10 victims, and finally, in December 2019, for offences related to a further 13 victims. The callousness of Sanaga was fully on display through each and every one of these hearings. He forced his victims to have to relive their ordeals, and the videos of the attacks were played in court. Sanaga appeared to be enjoying the trials, smirking throughout, and taking great pleasure in watching the videos of his attacks. The bravery of the victims has to be noted, as many of them testified in court and refused to do so behind screens, with them wishing to look Sanaga directly in the eyes. Other elements of Sanaga's depravity were fully exposed, including him sending friend requests to many of his victims on Facebook after the attacks, and the meticulous way that he collected trophies and documented his crimes. Sanaga would also boast to his friends about his sexual exploits, subtly admitting his crimes, with him saying that he would use a, quote, secret potion when having sex with men. Sanaga's defense was pathetic, with him claiming that all of his victims were consensual sexual partners, despite almost all of them being heterosexual and them obviously being unconscious in the videos. Some of the victims were heard snoring in the clips that were shown to the court. To no one's surprise, Sanaga was found guilty in all 4 trials and was eventually convicted of crimes against 48 victims, including 136 counts of rape, 14 counts of sexual assault, 8 counts of attempted rape, and 1 count of assault by penetration. Sanaga was sentenced at the conclusion of each trial, but I want to focus on the sentence from his last trial in December 2019, which occurred on January the 6th, 2020, in front of Judge Suzanne Goddard KC. She stated, quote, "You are a man of some intelligence and cunning, who has tried to counter each and every twist in the prosecution case as you gave evidence, hopeless though your efforts were. You showed no shame or remorse as the jury had to view hours of the most intimate footage. Your actions show you are a dangerous, deeply disturbed and perverted individual with no sense of reality. You described yourself as having behaved tenderly to the males who fell into your clutches. Nothing could be further from the truth. All of your actions were cold and calculated to avoid the males waking up during sex. You persisted in your denials of guilt in spite of the overwhelming nature of the evidence against you and the previous jury verdicts. You gave no thought to the deep distress and lasting psychological damage you will have caused these young men." Reference was also made to a probation pre-sentence report, where the author wrote, quote, "I am unable to conclude that Mr. Sanaga is anything other than extremely dangerous. His level of denial and the additional trials that are pending make it unlikely that the prison or probation service will make any progress with him in the foreseeable future." The judge then sentenced him. Reynald Sanaga was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 30 years in prison before he's able to apply for parole. This was then increased to 40 years at the Court of Appeal on the 11th of December 2020. This means Sanaga's earliest release date is 2060, when it will be 77 years of age. Given the level of danger he poses and his remorselessness, I think there's a strong likelihood that this man will spend the rest of his life behind bars. One of the senior police officers who led the investigation described Sanaga as, quote, "a psychopath," and added, quote, "Had he not been a narcissist and a psychopath, anyone else faced with such damning evidence would have admitted to what they've done." I would agree with this wholeheartedly, and there are elements of Sanaga's personality noted by friends which give an idea of the sort of man he was. He was deeply self-absorbed, obsessed with his own physical appearance and his importance to the world in general. One of his former housemates claimed that they actually had an argument with Sanaga because he was convinced that if he died, all life would come to an end. He couldn't seem to imagine the world continuing without him due to how important he was. He was an extreme narcissist. I believe that Sanaga is a man without any conscience or any remorse. Everyone in the world is there for him, and he can use and abuse as much as he wants. I think that he sees no problem with raping these men. They were there for his pleasure, and their level of consent and the horrific emotional and psychological harm his actions caused was secondary to him getting his needs met. Potentially his self-entitled attitudes and beliefs stem from his privileged upbringing. Sanaga primarily targeted heterosexual men, and I think this gave him a thrill, but also enabled him to further degrade them, with him believing that these straight males would be especially traumatized if they found out they were raped by a man. I think that Sanaga pleaded not guilty in order to be the center of attention and to relive his crimes over and over again. This man is an absolute monster. Police believe that Sanaga began sexually assaulting men as far back as 2005, when he was in Indonesia, and I have little doubt that the 206 victims he created in the UK is likely just a small proportion of the true number of people he violated in both countries. It is possible that Reynard Sanaga is the most prolific rapist not only in the UK, but potentially in the world. Hopefully he will never be released. Peter Scully is an Australian national and career criminal who will spend the rest of his life in jail in the Philippines, just committing some of the worst, most depraved, sexually motivated crimes against children the country and the world has ever seen. He is a man without remorse, a monster who abused and tortured children for his own sick sexual pleasure. He filmed and sold videos of his horrific crimes for his own profit. The things this man did almost defy belief. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Peter Gerald Scully was born on the 13th of January 1963 in Melbourne, Australia. I've not been able to find any real information about Scully's childhood or upbringing, but outwardly, he appears to have lived an ordinary life, to a point. Clearly, he was an expert at wearing masks during his life. Scully married and had 2 children, and the family lived in Naree Warren, a suburb of Melbourne. It's not clear when, but Scully left the family home to move into central Melbourne, no doubt to give him space to carry out his criminal endeavours. This included fraud on a large scale, with him being the co-director of at least 2 companies. Outwardly, these were property developers, which obtained $2.68 million in funding to build properties in the city of Ballarat, Victoria. However, there were no properties built, and the money was simply siphoned off. The fraud occurred between around 2004 and 2006, and when the companies eventually folded, they owed approximately $4 million to creditors. The Australian Securities and Investments Commission undertook an investigation in 2009 and found that Scully had committed 117 separate offences of fraud and deception. However, in 2011, before he could be arrested, Scully fled to Manila, the capital of the Philippines. Real estate fraud was not Scully's only criminal enterprise in Australia. He'd also gone to Malaysia and travelled back with a teenage girlfriend called Ling, although some articles state she was from the Philippines, who would then pimp out to individual clients and forced to attend sex parties. A witness recalled Scully locking a completely naked Ling out of their apartment in the middle of the night, apparently as some form of punishment. An associate of Scully's stated, quote, "Peter is driven by one thing, money, and it's clear that this is the case, and it's necessary to highlight this point front and centre in order to understand what came next." Scully was clearly a career criminal and a con man, and these individuals often have no empathy for their victims. They see them as a way to make gain for themselves. It seems Scully focused on 2 areas he knew would reap the most rewards: promises of massive gains from property developments and sex, with him willing to use and abuse anyone in any way in order to exploit these opportunities to make as much money as possible. Scully eventually set himself up on the island of Mindanao, living in the city of Cagayan de Oro, and it's here that he began to set up his international child sex abuse ring. Peter Scully is clearly a man who looked for opportunities to make money any way he could, and unfortunately, the Philippines is a notorious place for sex tourists, with many families living in abject poverty, a prime target for paedophiles, who will offer money to elevate the family in exchange for use of their children. In addition, there are an estimated 250,000, quote, street kids in the Philippines who spend their days begging and doing odd jobs in order to buy food. Out of these, around 75% are thought to have families they live with, but 25%, so around 62,000, have no families, no one looking out for them. They live and sleep on the streets, making them a natural target for predators. Unfortunately, the Philippines has become one of the global epicenters for the production and distribution of child pornography due to the ease with which paedophiles can gain access to victims and offend without real fear of being caught. Peter Scully became one of these men. He set up a dark web child pornography website called, quote, No Limits Fun, as a way to distribute the material he filmed to paedophiles around the world. The material that Scully filmed was what is known as, quote, hurtcore pornography, which is a topic that I've touched on before. This material is the worst end of the scale of child pornography, as it not only depicts acts of sexual violence against children, but it specifically tends to include their torture, with the victims often being extremely young, sometimes babies, with the whole point being to cause the victim as much emotional and physical harm as possible. As well as creating this material to sell, Scully would livestream himself raping and abusing children, taking requests of acts he should perform from his sick website members. Scully would seek out victims on his own, but he also had accomplices who would help him find children to horrifically abuse. There are two main ones I want to mention: Lizelle Margolo and Carmen Ann Alvarez, both of whom were about 17 years old when they met Scully, and it appears they themselves have been the victims of sex trafficking. Scully is known to have raped and tortured at least 8 children, but some reports state that the true number may be in the 60s. His most horrific crimes occurred in 2012 when he made a series of short films called, quote, Daisy's Destruction, which have become an urban legend and are considered, by those who've seen it, the worst child sex abuse material ever created. It's material that sickened even the most seasoned investigators and led to many of them suffering PTSD just from viewing it. Please know that all the child victims' names are pseudonyms. Even if I come across their real names, I would not use them. The Daisy's Destruction films depict 3 victims, who were Daisy, then aged 18 months old, Liza, aged 12, and Cindy, aged 11. In these videos, the children are raped and tortured. The most horrific behaviour is reserved for Daisy, who is filmed hung upside down, where she is beaten, burnt, and tortured, including being burnt with hot wax, all while screaming for help. Lizelle Margolo is seen wearing a mask in these videos, inflicting horrific physical abuse on the children. The title card on one of the parts, which specifically focuses on the abuse of Daisy, apparently reads, quote, Come see a child's mental ruin, her innocence lost, used as a tool. She'll learn to please her mistress. Her body will be ravaged, her dignity stolen. Later, the police would track down Daisy, who had suffered severe physical and emotional damage as a result of her abuse as a baby, as well as Liza, who was also similarly destroyed by the experience. However, the child known as Cindy could not be found. Margolo later told authorities that Scully had filmed himself in a separate video with Cindy, who, remember, was aged just 11 years old, and, after raping and torturing her, forced her to dig her own grave before strangling her with a rope. Her remains were later found buried underneath the property used by Scully. Police inquiries found that both Liza and Cindy had been given up by their parents into Scully's care, with the promise of food and a decent education. In the case of Cindy, her mother had died in 2012, and Margolo offered to adopt the child, telling them that she knew a man who could give her a decent future. Instead, this child was delivered into the hands of the devil, who abused and murdered her. Scully would sell these movies online. In the case of Daisy's Destruction, he would apparently sell this for $10,000. Scully raped and tortured other children, including a 5-year-old, and both Lizelle Margolo and Carmen Alvarez were involved in the abuse of these children, specifically their torture. In September 2014, Carmen Alvarez was tasked by Scully with finding him more children to abuse. Here is her speaking in her own words.
He said to me, can we adopt some street kids? And I said, I don't know, I don't think so. What if my sister to live with us? He said to me, no, I don't want your sister. I want a street kid to help them. Then I meet these two kids. Then I said to these kids, you want to come with me? And then the kids say, yes.
So you asked them to come home with you?
Yeah.
Because Peter wanted two girls?
Yeah.
And did he tell you what age he wanted?
He said he wants 9 and 12.
The two girls that Alvarez is talking about were 11-year-old Daisy and her 10-year-old cousin Queenie, who were hungry and hanging around a local shopping centre. After having a meal, she invited them back to Scully's property with the promise of food and shelter. Over the next 5 days, the children were raped and tortured by Scully, who forced them to dig their own graves, with him threatening that, if they tried to escape, they'd be murdered and placed in the holes. They were chained up and forced to wear dog collars, and each day they were taken back to the holes to dig a bit deeper to reinforce to them the consequences of defiance. On one occasion, one of the children woke up in the hole she had dug. She was told she'd been placed there, she'd been making too much noise, and she was crying for her mother. One of the children later said, quote, I wanted to kill myself. I wanted to die that night because I could not bear it any longer. On the 5th day, Alvarez released the girls, apparently feeling remorse for her role in Scully's crimes, although, in other reports I've read, it stated that the children simply found a way to escape on their own. However, regardless, these two children were able to escape and raise the alarm, telling the police what had happened to them. This led to Alvarez being arrested almost immediately, but Peter Scully and Lizelle Margolo went on the run. On the 20th of February 2015, Peter Scully was tracked down to Malay City in the Philippines and arrested on charges related to the rape and torture of the two cousins in September 2014. However, Lizelle Margolo was nowhere to be found, and she would evade authorities for 2 years. She spent this time apparently living in luxury, using the false name Shannon Carpio, with her presenting herself as the wife of a French software millionaire. She lived in a palatial condominium in the affluent Cebu city. Instead of keeping her head down, she could not help but show off her life, posting vain pictures of herself in revealing clothes online. Margolo would spend lavishly, spending money on designer clothes and luxury meals, telling her friends the money came from her rich husband. Instead, it's believed that she continued to organise the rape of more children, recruiting others to commit these offences, filming these acts and selling them online, possibly at the direction of Scully from prison. How she was eventually caught is unclear, but after 2 years on the run, Margolo was arrested and sent to prison to await her fate. Initially, Peter Scully was charged with 6 offences, which included 1 count of human trafficking and 5 counts of rape, charges he denied. However, he was convicted. On the 13th of June 2018, Peter Scully appeared before Judge Jose Escobedo, who sentenced him to life in prison. The judge also sentenced his accomplice, Carmen Alvarez, to life imprisonment. However, it took the combined effort of several law enforcement agencies to reveal the true scale of Scully's offending. Filipino authorities, Dutch police, and the Australian Federal Police all worked together to identify the victims of Scully's offending, identify him and his accomplices. Part of this involved looking at details which were filmed in order to link them to locations where the abuse had occurred and subsequently to Scully, but this took some time, so it wasn't until 2022 the answer to the other 60 charges which had now been brought against him, including multiple counts of child abuse, human trafficking, rape, and syndicating child pornography. Unfortunately, I've had difficulty confirming whether Scully was charged with the murder of Cindy, the poor 11-year-old girl whose remains were found buried under a property linked to him. Some reports say he was, some don't mention it. However, in subsequent interviews, Scully appears to confirm that he did kill this child. This is more related to him not denying this fact, rather than outwardly expressing his guilt. On the 3rd of November 2022, at Cagayan Oro Court, Peter Scully was convicted and sentenced to 129 years in prison. Also stood next to him was Lizelle Margolo, who had swapped her designer threads for prison clothes. She was sentenced to 126 years in prison for her part in Scully's crimes. Peter Scully was lucky to escape with his life, as the horrific nature of his crimes led to public outcry and the prosecutors pushed for the death penalty, which had not been used since 2006, to be brought back just for him. From what I can see, Peter Scully, who's now 60 years old, is incarcerated at Cagayan de Oro City Jail, where he's complained about the conditions. Oh, bless him. And he will inevitably spend the rest of his miserable life behind bars. Before speaking about Peter Scully, I want to introduce some clips from an interview with him in 2015.
So when you were on the run, how great was the urge?
Urge for what?
To find young girls.
Hardly ever had an urge. It's not like a hungry dog that's got to feed every 3 hours or 4 hours. It's not like that. And it's really not. It's almost not an urge.
Then why do it?
Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Why would you abuse an 18-month-old child?
Well, for a start, I didn't. And
Well, that's not true, is it?
It is true. No, I'm sorry, you're
Oh,
wrong.
I'm sorry. How old was she?
Huh?
How old was she, Peter?
You are confusing different things. I don't want to get into that.
How old was she?
Huh?
How old was she?
I don't want to get into any of that yet.
Right, okay. Whether that child was 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, or perhaps we're mixing it up with a 9-year-old child, or an 11-year-old girl, 12-year-old girl. You've done it to all of them, haven't you?
All right, I will go back to this now. No comment.
What is it about you, Peter, that hates children and women so much?
I might address that in the journal.
It just got crazier and crazier for you, and sicker, and you'd already committed murder. Where was it going to end? Like, what was the next level for you?
There was no next level.
And as a parent, how can you reconcile what you've done to children?
Next question, please.
Do you accept that you were ruining their lives as soon as you came in touch with them?
And the journal.
So you really have no sympathy for these people, for these kids?
That is definitely in the journal. I think we are finished.
I think we are.
Okay.
He can get up. Get up, please.
To clarify, Scully mentions a journal, and this is related to him stating, at the time, that he was going to write a tell-all manuscript about his crimes and his feelings around his offending. This is a cowardly move, with him just trying to kick the can down the road when asked specific questions, stating that the answers will come, but not yet, and only on his terms. I imagine this journal would not be free either, and so, again, Scully was looking for an angle to make some money. Whether he ever wrote this journal is unclear. These clips are so interesting, as you can tell the coldness and lack of empathy of Peter Scully. He couldn't even admit, despite what he'd done, which appears to include murder, that he'd ruined these innocent children's lives. I find it particularly disturbing when he says he never molested an 18-month-old, given that he filmed himself doing this. He's clearly trying to argue the age, stating that she was older, and somehow this makes a difference. I like the interviewer pushing back, and stating that, was she 2, 3 years old? Pointing out how little difference this makes to the horror that he put this and other children through. I do love Australians. They can be so scathing without raising their voice, and I love the bit at the end where the interviewer tells Scully to stand up and waits for the guards to take him back to the hole he crawled out of. I understand what the interviewer was trying to do, get Scully to express some level of remorse for his crimes. I think remorse is a somewhat overrated concept after a certain point. Yes, I think you can have someone who has hurt or killed someone in a moment of anger, and then, when the red mist dissipates, they can feel remorse and regret for their actions. but someone who systematically raped and tortured multiple children, and I've no doubt murdered at least one, is clearly a person who doesn't feel remorse or empathy or compassion. Otherwise they would not be able to do these things. Even if Peter Scully turned round and said, yes, I have remorse, given the gravity of his crimes, what real difference does such a statement make? Does it make up for the emotional, psychological, and physical destruction he caused? The innocence he took from these extremely vulnerable children? Peter Scully was a man driven by power and his own gratification. In Australia, this came from robbing people of their hard-earned money. I imagine he likely took great pleasure in living the high life and reveling in other people's misery, indicating his sadistic tendencies. I've no doubt that Peter Scully had researched his next project in the Philippines and was putting the pieces in place before he fled there. When he got there, he realised he could exert ultimate power over others through sexual violence, torture, and murder, whilst also making a profit. The children whose bodies he broke were merely objects he could use to live out his sadistic sexual fantasies and get rich from. They were disposable. I've no doubt that Scully is a sadistic psychopath, a man without remorse, and who, if released tomorrow, would go straight back to what he was doing. This man is truly evil, and is clearly one of the most dangerous child sex offenders of modern times. I'll also briefly mention his accomplice, Lizelle Margolo, clearly a sick, sadistic, psychopathic woman who clearly enjoyed abusing these children and living the high life off their misery. I think her current prison surroundings are more reflective of her true standing in life. At 12:49 a.m. on the 15th of January 2018, the following call was made to 999.
Ambulance service, is the patient breathing?
No,
They're not breathing?
no.
Okay. And who was it we're talking about?
Lexi, she's 3.
She's 3. Bear with
Yeah.
me. Okay. So she's unconscious and she's not breathing. So help has been arranged, okay?
The woman making this call, 21-year-old Louise Porton, had just murdered her 3-year-old daughter Lexi after 2 previous failed attempts, which left her fighting for her life. Porton smothered Lexi and waited hours to make sure she was dead before calling for an ambulance. Just 18 days later, Porton made another phone call for help as her 17-month-old daughter Scarlett had stopped breathing. Paramedics found that this child too had been dead for some time before help was called, with Porton having smothered her hours before. Porton is an evil, self-obsessed woman, utterly without conscience and remorse, who, whilst Lexi was fighting for her life during an unsuccessful attempt to kill her, was in the hospital toilet, sending topless photos of herself to men, and, when this child died, she was heard laughing at the funeral home. She also begged men for money to drive Scarlett to the hospital, knowing she was already dead. Her crimes, callousness, and likely motivation for murdering her own children is truly sickening, and I have no doubt will appall you. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Louise Porton was born in 1996 and raised in the market town of Walsall, in the county of Warwickshire, in the West Midlands of the UK. Despite apparently coming from a close family, Porton soon developed into a selfish, vindictive, violent and narcissistic child. Those close to Porton later testified in court that the family was close-knit, but she was always an outsider, and this was through choice. When the family would visit Porton's grandmother, Joy, she would sit with a scowl on her face in the corner, alone, whilst everyone else enjoyed their time together. If anyone sat near her, she would say, quote, "Go away or I'll smash your face." Porton would also be very vindictive. She would dig her nails into her cousin's skin when no one was looking, causing them to cry, and then she would deny all knowledge of this happening. She was reported to have never apologised for anything she did. When she was around 11 years old, Joy began noticing that every time that Porton would come round, items of money would go missing. It was clear that Porton was stealing from her grandmother. When challenged on this, Porton would use emotional manipulation to get her own way, telling her grandmother if she accused her of stealing, then she'd never come round again. So Joy would continue to let her come round, not wanting to lose connection with their family, and things would continue to go missing. From an early age, it was clear that Porton was obsessed with money and owning things. She was incredibly materialistic. Her abusive behaviour towards her family meant she was basically cut off from them, something she seemed to be indifferent about. The final straw came in 2016 when Porton was aged around 20 and when Joy became seriously ill and had to be admitted to hospital. It became clear quickly that she was not going to recover. One of her cousins later recalled, quote, "When Nan was in hospital, she was the only one who wouldn't come. I contacted Louise and told her they'd given Nan less than 24 hours, but she said, I can't make it. I told her it was the last chance. She said, I heard what you said, but I'm not coming. I just put the phone down. I was so emotional." After this point, the family cut her off. Porton herself appears to have been abandoned by her mother, Sharon Porton, which was around 11 years old, with her leaving the family home to begin another relationship, leaving their father to raise her and her 2 siblings. This understandably devastated Porton, as she didn't speak to her mother for a number of years, and this separation likely led to a deterioration of her own already concerning behaviour, which was entirely self-centred, with her quickly defining herself by money she stole and items she bought with her ill-gotten gains. Porton did reconnect with her mother Sharon when she reached adulthood, but the damage was likely already done by this point. While still a teenager, Porton became extremely promiscuous. She's reported to have had sex with anyone who would show her attention. Porton quickly realised that she could use this behaviour to make money for herself, and so would specifically seek out men with means, who, in exchange for sex, would give her cash or buy designer clothes or shoes or handbags, etc. By the age of 18 years old, she was signed up with various dating sites offering sexual services for money, and she would regularly go on Facebook to brag about how much money she was making from sex work, showing defiance of anyone who would call her out for her behaviour, claiming they were just jealous of how easily she could make money. Porton had, it would appear, some relationships that didn't revolve around payment. This included one with a man called Chris Draper. However, Porton was abusive within the relationship, deliberately bragging to Chris about the men she was sleeping with and the amount of money she was making. She seemed to get off on making others feel small. This union, such as it was, produced 2 beautiful children, both girls, Lexi Draper, who was born in 2014, and Scarlett Vaughan, who entered the world in 2016. Chris was estranged from his daughters at the time of their deaths in 2018. This was apparently due to Porton, as, in an act of complete malice, when she was pregnant with Scarlett, she moved to Rugby, a town 40 miles away, and forbid Chris from seeing Lexi. He was not there at the birth of Scarlett, and was forbidden from seeing her. He could only see pictures of her online. Tragically, he never met her before she died. Porter would emotionally abuse Chris online, claiming that neither child was his. However, Porton didn't care about the children. They were merely props, a thing to use to get what she wanted. She took them away from Chris to hurt him. This was all about what she wanted. This is shown in her caring for the children, and I use that term loosely. Porton would spend hours on internet dating sites, including Meet Me and Badoo, offering her services for as little as £30 while she was meant to be looking after the children. Messages recovered after her arrest show that she was bringing men back to the property where she lived. Her and her children shared a bedroom, but this didn't stop her. She messaged one client saying they could still have sex in the room as long as they were quiet so as not to wake the children. On another occasion, Porton went outside to have sex with a man in a van while the children were sleeping. She was also on various websites referring to herself as a, quote, model, including appearing under the name Lollipop on the website Purple Port. In court, her landlady, Leanne Bradley, said it was, quote, rare for Porton to look after the children, and she would often be asked to look after them when she was out to meet men. It got to the point where they were spending more time being looked after by Leanne than by their mother. When she was around, Porton was abusive to the children, and Leanne recalled in court, quote, they would cry and not always do what she asked them to do. She would tell them to shut the fuck up, or she would give them something to cry for. Porter would also sometimes leave the children with their mother, Sharon Porton. It seemed that she would only reach out to family when she wanted something. At their post-mortem, the children were found to have injuries to their bodies, suggesting that Porton had beaten them before their deaths. Porton would moan to everyone that she was a single mother, struggling to make ends meet and living in poverty. However, she was obsessed with posting pictures of her lifestyle, including shocking trips and various outfits she was buying. Clearly, every penny that she got was used on herself. She had long-term arrangements with some of the men she had sex with, and when she would snap her fingers, they would send money to her account to fund her shopping trips or pay for her petrol, etc. One of the measures recovered after her arrest showed her asking for money for pictures, with her saying, quote, "Tell me how much you put in and I will do pictures. If you put in enough, we can meet up and I will fuck you." Before discussing the horrific sequence of events that came next, I want to point out a few things. First and foremost is the extreme narcissism of Louise Porton. I've rarely seen a case with someone so fixated on themselves with no consideration for anyone else. Even people I'd met who have been deeply self-centered have a small glimmer of consideration for other people. If a family member was dying, even they would know that they should be there in person. However, if something didn't benefit Porton, then she wasn't interested. Her grandmother, a woman who had apparently been a consistent part of her life, was dying. But who cares? Can't be bothered. All Porton was interested in was money. Secondly is her utter vindictiveness, bordering, in my opinion, on sadism. She was, from a young age, someone who enjoyed causing harm to others, seeing them in distress. Later, she deliberately stopped a man from seeing his own children, purely, I think, to cause him pain. She even claimed that he wasn't the father, an act of pure spite. Likely, this also explains the reason she didn't see her grandmother before she died. She wanted her to be upset that family member didn't come to see her. Porton wanted her to suffer. Lastly, is Porton's complete lack of remorse at any stage of her life. She didn't feel bad about harming her cousins as a child, or stealing from her grandmother. She didn't feel anything when she died, and thought nothing of ripping a man away from his children, or depriving them of a father. It was widely reported later that Porton killed her children as they got in the way of her sex life, and this seems to have stuck, as is the angle the prosecution played. But, as I come back to later, this was not accepted by the judge, and is not actually what the evidence shows. The reason why Porton did what she did, in my opinion, was far, far more complex and much more sinister, and I'll highlight this as we go along, and I'm confident that, by the end, you'll agree this woman is pure evil. By January 2018, Louise Porton had decided to kill her children. She began with 3-year-old Lexi. Before finally ending her life, Porton tried to kill her on at least 2 occasions. On the 2nd of January 2018, a call was made to 999 by Porton, saying that Lexi was experiencing breathing difficulties. Paramedics rushed to the property and found Lexi unconscious. She was soon revived and taken to hospital, arriving there at around 1 a.m. Text messages show that during the ride to the hospital, and whilst her daughter was being treated, Porton was sending messages to someone about a, quote, happy ending, and at 1:18 a.m, she was arranging a meeting with a man and telling him he needed to pay cash up front. At around 6 a.m, Lexi was discharged from hospital. In the early hours of the 4th of January 2018, another call was made to 999 by Porton, who said that Lexi was again struggling to breathe. Paramedics rushed to the property again and found Lexi unconscious, lying on her back on the floor. A paramedic who attended said in court that her condition was critical, that Lexi was suffering from severe breathing difficulties. She was stabilised at the scene and rushed to the hospital. Without this intervention, Lexi would have died. The paramedic said that Porton was, quote, not distressed at all in the back of the ambulance, and he stated he believed that she was drinking wine from a glass when he first attended. Whilst Lexi was fighting for her life in hospital, Porton was in the toilet, taking selfies of her breasts to send to people she was arranging to meet for sex. She acted the concerned mother to various men she messaged, and to at least one, she said, quote, really need funds to help me get by. And this, here, is in my opinion the primary motivation for why Porton did what she did. Money. As it will be shown moving forward, anytime she could use a tragedy to turn a profit, she would. Tragically, it wouldn't be determined until after her death that Lexi had been strangled by Porton, resulting in her almost dying on 2 occasions. It seems that Lexi was only in hospital until late on the 4th of January or the 5th of January 2018, and during this time, Porton was making various searches, including, quote, can you actually die if you have a blocked nose and cover your mouth with tape? And how long after drowning could someone be resuscitated? She was also reading articles about children who'd been brought back to life after drowning. On the 6th of January 2018, rather than looking after her daughter, who had just come out of hospital, Porton was offering her sexual services to a man for the entire day for £300. Louise Porton decided to finally kill Lexi on the 14th of January 2018, and, the day before, made further harrowing online searches, including, quote, "How long does it take for a dead body to go cold up to the shoulder?" She also sent a message to a man saying that a doctor had said that Lexi had flu and would soon pass away. This was clearly a lie. This harrowing CCTV footage shows Lexi entering the family home for the last time, being followed by her sister. Just a few hours later, Porton would suffocate Lexi by placing either her hand or some other object over her nose and mouth. Porton then waited hours to make sure Lexi was dead and there was no chance of her being revived. Only then did she make the 999 call I played at the beginning of the video, which was made at 12:49 AM on the 15th of January 2018. Paramedics again returned to the same address they'd been to twice before in the last 2 weeks, but this time there was no saving Lexi. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Paramedics were concerned, as Lexi had clearly been dead for hours, and they were not convinced by Porton's claims that she'd found her daughter lifeless in bed and called an ambulance straight away. Again, Porton showed no emotion and didn't shed a tear at the death of her daughter. The next day, Porton was back online arranging sex with men. On screen, a conversation was recovered from this day, the 16th of January 2018, and as you can see, she describes herself as a model, but says she's taking a break because, quote, "My little girl passed away yesterday." However, within an hour and a half, Porton is talking to another man called Leon, arranging a, quote, "date." Porton couldn't even pretend to care, and a few days later was seen laughing at her funeral directors and yawning when discussing the arrangements for Lexi. She also sent a message to a friend, making a joke that she'd gone from 2 children to just 1. On January the 19th, 2018, post-mortem examination was conducted on Lexi, but a cause of death couldn't be determined. It was concluded that death wasn't natural and was unexplained, but at the time, not suspicious. Various samples were sent away for analysis. Unfortunately, the results of these tests would not be returned in time, as, just 18 days later, Louise Porton killed for the second time. This time, she ended the life of her 17-month-old daughter, Scarlett. On the 1st of February 2018, Louise Porton and Scarlett were staying in a hotel, I believe due to some issue with their own property. CCTV footage from 6:55 PM shows Porton carrying Scarlett up to the hotel room, where, likely within minutes, she was suffocated by her own mother, in the same way Lexi had been murdered. There's no doubt that, by around 7:30 PM, Scarlett was dead. Porton again sat with her daughter's body to make sure she was dead. She didn't call for help. Her utter callousness was shown by messages sent during this time. As shown on screen, note that she describes Scarlett as being, quote, "not well," and at 9:22 PM, she begins messaging a guy saying, quote, "Any chance of putting 30 in my bank now for fuels to get my daughter Scarlett to the hospital? I'll transfer it back Wednesday." So, with her daughter already dead, Porton is trying to get money. I have no words for this woman, I really don't. Finally, confident that her daughter was dead, at around 10 PM, Porton strapped Scarlett in a car seat and was seen driving. 15 minutes later, she stops at a petrol station to fill up her vehicle, apparently without a care in the world. At this point, she's standing mere feet away from her dead daughter, who is strapped into the car seat. You would think that Porton was driving to the hospital. No, soon after filling up her car, she pulled over and dialed 111, the non-emergency medical advice line in the UK, and said that Scarlett had become unwell when they were driving, and then she stopped breathing. Porton then returned to the hotel, unstrapped her daughter from the car seat, and returned her to the room where she'd been murdered. Paramedics arrived at around 11 PM, and it was clear there was nothing that could be done for Scarlett. She was freezing cold, and her body was stiff, indicating that she'd been dead for hours. So, By the age of just 21, and within the space of 18 days, Louise Porton had murdered her 2 children. The deaths of 2 children, with no significant medical history, just 18 days apart, obviously raised alarm bells. And on the 2nd of February 2018, a post-mortem was conducted on Scarlett and a further one completed on Lexi. Various tests were completed and samples taken, and Warwickshire police were notified, and a murder investigation was started. Unfortunately, a case like this takes time to compile, and Porton will remain at liberty for almost a year before justice finally caught up with her. In the immediate aftermath, Porton showed absolutely no emotion in the days after losing her 2nd child. She was described as going to an appointment with a housing officer on the 5th of February 2018 and being completely calm and emotionless. On March the 20th, 2018, Louise Porton was arrested on suspicion of murdering Lexi and Scarlett and released under investigation. It's clear the police didn't have enough evidence to charge her, but I always think this is a shot across the bow, letting the perp know it's only a matter of time, hoping they'll crumble or make a mistake. However, Porton was unfazed, and sickeningly, in June 2018, she posted an ad on Facebook selling her dead children's clothes. I mean, look at this image. The clothes of her dead children have basically been stuffed into a bin bag and are also strewn all over the floor. I've no doubt this is a reflection of how she saw her own children and how she treated them. Porton carried on doing what she would do for years, arranging sex with men online, claiming to be a model, but also using the death of her own children to make a profit, including selling their clothes. On the 24th of November 2018, she uploaded this disgusting post as a tribute to the children she'd murdered, which reads, quote, "Mummy's angels, take from me too soon, you'll never be forgotten. R.I.P. However, whilst the police were slowly working behind the scenes to build a case, Porton had already been convicted in the court of public opinion. She was subjected to constant trolling, and her response was to post things like, quote, "Fuck the haters." Initially in Porton's corner was her mother Sharon, who I think just didn't want to believe her daughter was capable of these things. But in March 2018, Sharon posted a message on Facebook saying that her daughter had punched her to the floor. Finally, in January 2019, enough evidence had been gathered to prove not only that Lexi and Scarlett had been suffocated to death by Porton, but she'd also tried to kill Lexi on 2 previous occasions. In addition, all of Porton's social media posts and messages had been catalogued, and on January the 25th, 2019, Louise Porton was rearrested and charged with the murders of 3-year-old Lexi Draper and 17-month-old Scarlett Vaughan, and she was remanded into custody to await her day in court. To no one's surprise, Louise Porton pleaded not guilty to all charges, and her trial started on the 3rd of July 2019 at Birmingham Crown Court. As I said at the beginning of the video, the prosecution framed this as Porton killing her children because they got in the way of her sex life. But over the 28-day trial, this wasn't the picture that was outlined. Although this claim stuck, it was shown that Porton carried on her sex life, regardless of whether the children were there or not. There was no real change in her activity before the children were born or after they died. Porton gave evidence, but simply denied any wrongdoing, stating that she loved her children and had no reason to kill them, but her cold demeanour didn't help her case. On the 31st of July 2019, the jury went out to deliberate and returned within 24 hours to deliver unanimous guilty verdicts to the charges of murdering Lexi and Scarlett. The next day, the 2nd of August 2019, Porton stood before Mrs. Justice Yip for sentencing. She described Porton's actions as both, quote, evil and calculated. She stated, quote, "These were blameless, young children who were plainly vulnerable and ought to have been able to rely on their mother to protect and nurture them. Instead, you took their young lives away." She said there were no obvious signs of Porton suffering from any mental illness, but that, quote, "It's plainly part of your makeup that you find it difficult to make and sustain emotional attachments and to put the needs of others ahead of your own." She then sentenced her for the murders of Lexi Draper and Scarlett Vaughan Louise Porton was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 32 years before she can apply for parole. Porton showed no emotion during her sentencing. Aside from her current prison being publicised, HMP Foston Hall, a women's closed prison in the village of Foston in Derbyshire, little has been reported about Porton's time inside. I imagine she won't have an easy time of it. I'll have to grow up quickly in this environment. Lexi and Scarlett were finally laid to rest, together, on the 3rd of September 2019, with their tiny coffins being carried in a carriage drawn by 4 white horses, taking them on their final journey. Their funeral was organised by their father, Chris Draper, who said that he wanted to give them, quote, "the send-off you deserved." I cannot imagine the pain this man endured, burying both his children, including one he'd never met. In a victim impact statement in court, Chris spoke about things suicidal after the death of his children. He said, quote, "I am broken. I keep asking myself, why did Louise do something so evil to our beautiful daughters?" He continued, quote, "No punishment will ever be enough, as I'll never get my daughters back." After the funeral, he wrote on Facebook, quote, "Gave you the send-off you deserved. All eyes on you, and you'll be missed, but never forgotten. Sleep tight, babies. Daddy's got you. Daddy will always have your back. Sleep tight. Love, your daddy." I hope with all sincerity that Lexi and Scarlett are safe, loved, and together for the rest of eternity. Rest in peace, little angels. The death of the children also devastated their grandmother, Sharon Porter, and, in a terrible postscript, she committed suicide on the 2nd of September 2020. Friends said she struggled to cope with the grief of losing her grandchildren and the guilt that she raised a monster and had not stopped her. It also appears that she was receiving a lot of abuse for the actions of her daughter. So, Louise Porton's behaviour, her evil, claimed the lives of, in my opinion, 3 people, and irreparably destroyed the lives of many, many more. As I said, despite the prosecution claiming that Porton killed her children to continue sex working, the more I look into this case, the less I agree with this statement. Even if this was part of the rationale, I think it's a minor part, that she was happily going along, doing whatever she was doing, and simply palming the children off on others. Instead, I think the Porton's motivation was, at a very basic level, financial. She killed her children because of money, but it's much more complicated than that. Let's start from the beginning. There's not much about Porton's early life, but it's clear that something was seriously wrong with her from a young age. Whether she was born this way or developed into this is unclear, but it's apparent that she was extremely antisocial and enjoyed hurting people. Underneath her behaviour, I think, was insecurity and extremely low self-esteem, with her using violence to make herself feel better about herself. Quickly, money became a way for her to feel good about herself. Money meant she could buy things, designer clothes, handbags, etc., to portray herself as successful, powerful, in order to hide from the damaged person she was. She began sleeping with anyone and everyone. This is commonly an indicator of underlying issues with self-esteem, with people looking for validation, even briefly through sex, feeling wanted for that brief period of time, before having to confront how they actually feel about themselves. In order to avoid this, they keep having sex again and again and again, to avoid confronting their underlying issues. Porton realised she could combine the two things. Men would pay her for sex. Win-win. She'd get the validation she wanted, whilst also making money, which she could use to fund her lifestyle. I think getting money to maintain this was her sole purpose in life. She needed money in order to keep the shaky foundations of her pretend life from collapsing. She couldn't stand to acknowledge the person she actually was, or let the world see a glimpse of the damaged little girl she was. She was also horrendously spiteful. Any opportunity she could to hurt someone, she would take. And, by harming them, she felt powerful, reveling in other people's misery. Again, I'm sure this was a way for her to offset her own feelings of inadequacy. And this last reason is why she took her 2 children away from their father. Out of spite, she wanted him to suffer by not being able to see the children. They were simply pawns to be used. I think she thought little more than achieving this objective. She didn't think, how am I going to raise these children? I think when this dawned on her, she realised she was completely incapable. In court, Paulson admitted that she found parenting difficult. I think it was because she'd spent so many years being utterly self-absorbed that she had no ability to care for anyone but herself. If she was struggling, she could have contacted social services, or asked for help, or returned them to their father, or any number of things. But of course she didn't. That would make her look bad. Forget the fact she would have the children, it'd mean that she'd have to admit fault. Her carefully crafted image would come crumbling down. So I firmly believe she resented the children, despite her putting them in that situation. They were at fault. They didn't benefit her in any way, and likely, she saw them as a drain on her resources. She was having to spend money on them and devote time to raising them, which took focus away from the most important thing in the world to her, herself. I think Paulson then realised that with these objects, because that's how she saw them, out of the way, there'd be more money for her, and sickeningly, I've no doubt that she was going to use the death of her children to rinse people for everything they were worth. We saw examples of this, saying she was struggling to cope when Lexi was in hospital, and needing money for petrol when taking Scarlett to hospital, and selling the children's clothes mere months after their death. The children's bodies were not released for burial until after Paulson's arrest in 2019, but I've absolutely no doubt whatsoever that she'd been in charge of their funerals. She would have set up as many fundraising pages as she could and begged for money from everywhere. She would have then paid for the cheapest funeral possible whilst pocketing the rest of the money, which she could then spend to keep on living a life which enabled her to avoid actually looking into the deep, dark hole of nothingness inside of her. I think she only didn't do this because she knew the police were circling, and I have no doubt that, as part of her sex work, the issue of how she was struggling to deal with the death of her 2 children and how desperate she was for money must have come up. This profile, I think, is more accurate. I would suggest that Louise Porton is what is known as a malignant narcissist, which is a severe condition which combines the traits of several different personality disorders, including narcissism, antisocial behaviour, aggression, and sadism, meaning essentially this type of individual will abuse others without remorse and often take great pleasure in this behaviour in order to get their own way. In the case of Louise Porton, she was willing to smother her own children, something that would have taken minutes, just so that she could maintain her lifestyle and continue to avoid the terror of admitting who she really was to herself and others. Saying that she did these things as the children got in the way of her sex life is a dangerous oversimplification. Louise Porton is a woman who will target, victimise, and kill anyone in order to get her own way. The chances of her being treated are, in my opinion, incredibly low. So, when she's released, I think she'll pose a serious danger to anyone who gets close to her. If she felt in the future that killing a child would help her make gain for herself, she would, without hesitation. But I think by the time she's released, which will be when she's in her 50s at the earliest, she would potentially change her MO. I can imagine her slithering herself into the lives of wealthy men and finding some way to take everything from them, potentially, if it benefited her, their lives. In this respect, I think that Louise Porton is an extremely dangerous predator who, in my humble opinion, isn't likely to ever be safe to be released. I just wanted to say something about this case. I read somewhere that concerns were raised to social services about Porton's parenting before the murders, but I have literally no information about what their involvement was, or the lack thereof. I'd be shocked, given her behaviour, that she didn't flag up on someone's radar. This is the sort of case I would expect to have been reviewed at a national level, and I'll keep an eye out in case there is a report. If I find out any more details, I'll do an update on this case. Anyway, Lucy Letby is the 33-year-old woman who works as a registered nurse in the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital from 2011 to 2016, which offers high dependency care for babies who are often extremely unwell, including those who are born prematurely. The children here are the most vulnerable, the most in need of love, professional care and protection, with the staff who work in this unit being tasked with one of the greatest responsibilities in the entire medical field. Letby utterly abused this trust, and in the space of just 12 months, murdered 7 babies and attempted to murder 6 others, with most of her victims being days, or in some cases hours old. This is a shocking case which has been in the newspapers since her first arrest in July 2018. It was only at her trial that the true scale of Letby's horrific crimes and her completely inhumane behaviour were laid bare, showing that she is an extremely dangerous, calculating and depraved woman who has now been proven to be a serial killer and one of the worst child killers in UK history. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Lucy Letby was born on the 4th of January 1990 in the city of Hereford, in the county of Herefordshire, in the UK. She's the only child of Susan and John Letby, and was apparently raised in what has been described as a middle-class family. Letby attended mainstream school and was described as an awkward but polite child, who her friends described as one of the, quote, geeky girls. From a very young age, Letby wanted to be a nurse, and so, after school, she enrolled in the University of Chester to study nursing, graduating with a degree in 2011. She was the first person from her family to go to university and was described by friends as, quote, always the first home on a night out, taking her studies seriously. Letby remained in the city of Chester and joined the Countess of Chester Hospital straight after graduation, began working in the neonatal unit of the hospital, which is shown in this video, which hauntingly shows the scene of Letby's crimes. She would remain working here until her first arrest in 2018. However, it should be noted that while she was mainly based here, she did cover shifts at other hospitals. Letby had been the focus of some attention in her role. On the 6th of February 2012, she appeared in a photo holding a baby as part of a story about a resident who had donated money to the hospital's appeal. On the 28th of March 2013, Letby was the subject of a short interview about her job, in which she stated her role at the hospital involved, quote, caring for a wide range of babies requiring various levels of support, and that she enjoyed, quote, seeing them progress and supporting their families. A picture that has become synonymous with this case was taken whilst Letby completed a placement at Liverpool Women's Hospital. In addition, on the 6th of August 2015, Letby appeared in a newspaper article about fundraising. However, by the time this article was published, Letby had killed 4 children and attempted to murder 2 others. Lucy Letby was sociable and outgoing. She seemed to have a good circle of friends. Several photos have been released of her on nights out, having a good time. She seemed, outwardly, entirely normal. There's no recorded abuse in her background, and Lucy Letby appeared to be completely normal to those around her. She had no disciplinary issues at work, and there were no obvious concerns about her behaviour whilst working as a nurse. This is what made what happened over the course of just 12 months, between June 2015 and June 2016, so inexplicable. With Letby engaging in a campaign of murder, she would shock the country. All the victims were referred to by letters in the court proceedings, and I'll follow this pattern. But, whilst they're referred to as child A, B, etc., I'm going to predominantly call them babies, because that's what they were. This reinforces the fragility of those that Letby targeted and killed. We're going to go through each crime, each murder, each attempted murder, as I think that's the only way that the true horror in this case can be laid bare. Lucy Letby's first confirmed murder victim was a baby boy known as A, who was born prematurely at 8:31 p.m. on the 7th of June 2015, and he was admitted to the neonatal intensive care unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital. The next day, he was improving and was breathing on his own in his incubator and was being fed express breast milk. Despite being premature, baby A was relatively healthy. At 7:30 p.m. on the 8th of June 2015, Lucy Letby came on shift and had a handover meeting with the day nurse who'd been assigned to look after A. Letby then went onto the ward at 8 p.m, and just 26 minutes later, she called a senior doctor to the baby's incubator and said the baby was in distress. They noticed odd discoloration on the boy's skin, who was now unconscious and in cardiac arrest. Despite attempts to revive him, baby A was pronounced dead at 8:58 p.m, just over 24 hours after his birth. It was determined that baby A had most likely been injected with air into his bloodstream minutes before his cardiac arrest. So this would mean that Letby had injected air into this child's body at around 8:20 p.m, just 20 minutes after she entered the ward. She'd never met this child before, so killed him within 20 minutes of seeing him for the first time. As this recurring theme, I want to summarise why air in the bloodstream is so dangerous. Basically, injecting air introduces gas bubbles into the body, which then can block the passage of blood, leading to organs shutting down. If this occurs in the heart, it can lead to a heart attack. In the brain, it can result in stroke. It can prove fatal extremely quickly. An expert at court stated the injection of air into Bailey A's body was done, quote, by someone who knew it would cause significant harm. Just over 24 hours after murdering Bailey A, Letby targeted his twin sister, Bailey B, who was also in intensive care on the neonatal unit. Just before midnight on the 9th of June 2015, doctors were alerted to the fact that B's blood oxygen level was dangerously low, and the nasal prongs which were feeding her additional oxygen had been removed. These were replaced, and B was given additional oxygen, which meant she luckily stabilised. It's believed that Letby removed the prongs and also potentially injected her with oxygen. Bailey C was a little boy, born prematurely at 30 weeks, weighing just 800 grams, and was in intensive care, but was doing well. The late evening of the 13th of June 2015, approximately 5 days after his birth, Lucy Letby was on shift and had been assigned to look after a poorly baby in the adjacent room. The assigned nurse for baby C stepped out briefly, and when she returned, she found Lucy Letby in the room and the child in cardiac arrest. It's believed that Lucy Letby, in those few moments that baby was left alone, had injected air into his body via his nose tube. Doctors battled to save baby C's life, but were unable to. His parents were sat in the family room, obviously going out of their mind with worry, and Letby kept going in there and had to be told by a senior nurse to leave them alone, as she wasn't even the assigned nurse for their child. Doctors couldn't save C, but kept working on him for an entire hour so that the parents could organise for their child to be baptised. Knowing the baby would not survive, he was handed to his parents to spend the last few seconds with him. He was still gasping and had a pulse, but the doctors explained this was merely a brainstem response and would soon stop. However, whilst trying to spend precious seconds with their baby boy, C's father later recalled a nurse, he believed to be Letby, come in holding a basket to take the body away, with her saying, quote, "You've said your goodbyes, do you want me to put him in here?" This poor man was shocked, and he recalled in a written statement his wife saying, quote, "He's not dead yet." The next day, Letby looked up the parents on Facebook. The timing of this search indicates it was the first thing she likely did when she woke up the next day. She's shown to have repeatedly searched for them for months afterwards, including on Christmas Day. Baby D, a little girl, was born at 4:01 p.m. on the 20th of June 2015. She wasn't premature and weighed 6 pounds 14 ounces at birth. However, there were some concerns about her breathing, so she remained in the hospital under observation. Tragically, at court, it was disclosed that D ended up on the neonatal ward due to a mistake made by the hospital. On the 21st of June 2015, when the parents went to see their newborn, D's mother spotted Letby hovering by her daughter. At one point, the mother said that, quote, she was sort of hovering around D, not doing much. She had a clipboard to take notes. It got to the point where D's mother asked her husband to ask Letby to leave the room so they could spend time alone with their daughter. At around 4 a.m. on the 22nd of June 2015, just 2 days after Dee's birth, her parents were woken up in the room they were sleeping in and told that their daughter's condition had deteriorated rapidly. Moments before this, Letby had injected air into the child's bloodstream. Doctors battled to save her life and were able to revive her twice. When she was revived the second time, Dee was distressed and crying before going into respiratory and cardiac arrest for a third time. She could not be revived. She died. Just hours after murdering baby D, Lucy Letby was messaging friends with one text saying, quote, "We had such a rubbish night. Our job is just far too sad sometimes," and that she was having, quote, "a tough time." In response, colleagues were reassuring her that she was not at fault and simply needed a break. Lucy Letby again looked up the parents of baby D on Facebook soon after their daughter's murder. Baby E was a little boy, one of twins who was meant to be born in a different hospital, but due to a lack of bed space, his mother was sent to the Countess of Chester Hospital, where she gave birth to twins on the 31st of July 2015. Both children were premature and needed extra support, so was sent to the neonatal unit. On the evening of the 3rd of August 2015, E's mother visited her son in the unit and walked in to find Letby standing over him, and he had blood pouring from his mouth. Letby reassured E's mother, saying that everything was okay and that a senior doctor would soon be coming in to check on her son's condition. She ushers the mother out of the room, saying, quote, "Trust me, I'm a nurse." Doctors rushed to help E, who had blood pouring out of his nose and mouth. It's not clear what Letby did exactly, but it's believed she forced some instrument, potentially a feeding tube, down E's throat, causing a massive amount of damage. She'd also injected him with air. Repeated attempts were made to resuscitate child E, but it was fruitless, and he died in the early hours of the 4th of August 2015. Lucy Letby then falsified medical records to try and make it look as though she was in a different room when baby E began to deteriorate. The next day, the 5th of August 2015, Lucy Letby attempted to murder baby E's twin brother, baby F. He was being fed intravenously through a bag, and Letby switched her weapon of choice. This time, she injected insulin into the bag. Soon after this, his heart rate dropped, but doctors were able to stabilize him. Insulin is a naturally occurring hormone made by your pancreas that helps regulate the amount of sugar, also known as glucose, in your blood, helping it be sent to your organs to function, or putting it into storage for later use. Glucose is the body's fuel, and too much insulin means too much glucose is taken from the bloodstream, meaning there's not enough fuel for your organs to function. In severe cases, this can lead to organ damage or organ failure, unconsciousness, and even death. Again, soon afterwards, Lucy Letby took to Facebook to search for the family of babies E and F, including on Christmas Day. Her next victim would be baby G, a baby girl who was born very prematurely in a different hospital, weighing just 1 pound 2 ounces at birth. She was transferred to the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital in August 2015 and was doing well. When she was 100 days old, the staff had a little party to mark the milestone, but the next day, the 7th of September 2015, Lucy Letby fed an excessive amount of milk to baby G through her nasogastric tube, and also, probably, injected her with air at the same time. The reaction was almost immediate. Baby G was in horrific amounts of distress and was struggling to breathe whilst projectile vomiting. Doctors worked to save her and succeeded, as she was sent to another hospital where she soon recovered. She was then returned to the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester on the 16th of September 2015. On the 21st of September 2015, Lucy Letby was working a day shift, and in the morning, she again fed baby G an excessive amount of milk and likely again injected air into her bloodstream. Again, she began to projectile vomit and briefly stopped breathing before being stabilized. She was then put on a monitor to measure her oxygen level and her heart rate. But around 3 p.m. that same afternoon, Letby was heard to shout for help and was found standing over baby G, who was again struggling to breathe, and Letby was apparently trying to help stabilize her. The monitor had been switched off. Doctors intervened and baby G was saved due to Letby having, quote, discovered her in time. The murder of baby I, a baby girl, is particularly heinous and shows the evil of Lucy Letby, her determination to kill the children she targeted, as well as her sadistic behaviour linked to her crimes. Before eventually taking baby I's life, Letby attempted to kill her 3 times before succeeding. Baby I was 2 months old. She was in the neonatal unit due to being born prematurely, but she was doing well. On the 30th of September 2015, baby I was found struggling to breathe, just 30 minutes after Letby had fed her. On the 13th of October 2015, another nurse on the night shift saw Letby lurking in the doorway of baby I's room. They then checked on her and found that she looked extremely pale and was obviously struggling to breathe. Again, baby I was stabilized. In the early hours of the 23rd of October, another collapse occurred, but baby I was resuscitated and recovered to the point where she was showing signs of hunger. Less than an hour later, an alarm went off and doctors rushed to baby I's incubator and found Letby stood beside it. Baby I went into respiratory and cardiac arrest and could not be revived. It appears that on each occasion, Letby had injected air into this child's bloodstream. Baby I's mother was obviously devastated by the loss of her daughter, who was doing so well, and As part of the bereavement service offered by the unit, she was given time alone with her daughter to give her a bath and say her goodbyes. However, she said in court later that when she was alone with her daughter bathing her, Letby came into the room, quote, smiling, and kept going on about how she was present at baby I's first bath and how much baby I had loved it. This obviously distressed baby I's mother. She was trying to spend time with her daughter for the last time, and Lucy Letby was there beaming in this tragic moment. I want to refer to the line of questioning regarding this incident from Lucy Letby's trial in 2023. These are all direct quotes. So, with regard to the comment about the bath, the prosecution asked her, "Why did you say that?" Letby replied, "I was trying in this awful situation to have a little bit of normality, and I was referring to a positive memory. It was not meant with any malice. It was just trying to reflect on a happier memory." The prosecution said, "How can you sit there and say baby I was enjoying her first bath when she was dead?" Letby said, "She had her first bath when she was alive. That was what I was referring to. I was referring to the earlier bath."
Just a break here, there was no earlier bath. The prosecutor asked, were you getting a thrill out of what you were watching, the grief and despair you were watching in that room? Letby said, absolutely not. In addition, Lucy Letby sent a letter of condolence to the family of baby I, something the nurses never usually did. Babies L and M were newly born twin boys. On the 9th of April 2016 during the day shift, Letby injected insulin into baby L, having increased the dosage she used before. She also injected air into baby M's bloodstream. I believe these children were in the same room. Both children became poorly quickly. With regards to baby L, he was described as, quote, close to death after his heart rate and breathing dropped dramatically without warning, but he improved on the night shift that day when Letby was not around or went on to make a speedy recovery. Baby M was also stabilised quickly and recovered when Letby was not on shift. Baby N was a baby boy who was born at 34 weeks, weighing only 3 pounds 6 ounces, and Lucy Letby attempted to kill him 3 times. At 1 a.m. on the 3rd of June 2016, he suffered a sudden lowering of his blood oxygen levels due to Letby most likely injecting him with air. 12 days later, on the 15th of June 2016, Letby tried to kill baby N twice in one day. The first time, in the morning, by shoving a breathing tube down his throat, which caused blood in his mouth, restricting his breathing, which made it difficult for doctors to help him. At 3 p.m, he again was having difficulty breathing, and blood was again found in his mouth, suggesting that Letby had repeated the same thing and forced a breathing tube down his throat. However, he was able to be stabilised and subsequently recovered. Lucy Letby's last confirmed murder victims were a pair of baby boys, baby O and baby P, who were 2 triplets. Baby O lost his life on the 23rd of June 2016. He was healthy, but then suddenly
rapidly declined. He could not be resuscitated. During his post-mortem, bruising was found to his liver, which was assumed to have been down to damage caused when doctors tried to save his life. However, it appears that Letby potentially hit this child with some force to his abdomen, as well as injecting him with air. Just a day later, Lucy Letby murdered baby P, baby O's brother,
and the second child of the triplets. Preparations were being made to move baby P to another hospital when Letby is reported to have told a doctor, quote, "He's not leaving here alive, is he?" Soon afterwards, baby P died, having air injected into his stomach, which then caused respiratory shutdown. Lucy Letby, in the space of just 12 months, had murdered 7 babies and attempted to murder 6 others. After the deaths of babies O and P in June 2016, Lucy Letby was moved to an administrative role, meaning she was still employed by the NHS but had no access to patients. This move was due to doctors in the hospital firmly believing that Letby was involved in these deaths and others. In terms of the stats, there was a 10% increase in the number of fatalities in the unit solely due to Letby's actions. Despite significant concerns, the police were not called immediately. I believe this didn't happen for over a year. Instead, internal investigations were conducted, as well as consultation with the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health and the Royal College of Nursing, who carried out their own investigations and completed reports. Eventually, based on these investigations, Cheshire Police were eventually contacted. It was apparent that someone had caused the deaths and injuries of numerous children, and the only consistent person present during all of these incidents was Lucy Letby, as shown by this chart. On the 3rd of July 2018, Lucy Letby was arrested by the police for the first time on suspicion of 8 counts of murder and 6 counts of attempted murder, and this video shows the knock on the door at her property in Westbourne Road, Chester, and also a very short clip of her police interview, which is all that's been released at the time of recording.
Hello, Lucy, is it?
Yes.
Hello, my name's Chester, please. Can we get Steph in 2 seconds?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, not a problem.
I'm going to put you in the back seat over here.
Hold on, man.
Yes.
Get this.
Okay, just take a seat in there for me, Lucy. I'll move that seat forward a bit. Shortly.
Yeah, I've just had knee surgery.
So oh, right, okay.
They told me that there would be a lot more deaths and that I'd been linked to somebody that was there for a lot of them. Did you have any concerns that there was a rise in the mortality rate? Yes. Okay, so tell me about that. What concerns did you have? I think we don't just notice as a team in general, the nursing staff, that this was a rise compared to previous years. They told me that there would be a lot more deaths and that I'd been linked to somebody that was there for a lot of them. Did you have any concerns that there was a rise in the mortality rate? Yes. Okay, so tell me about that. What concerns did you have? I think we don't just notice as a team in general, the nursing staff, that this was a rise compared to previous years.
Lucy Letby's home was searched, and the police were covered incriminating evidence almost immediately. Most concerningly were notes that Letby had written, which appeared to be confessions to her crimes. These will be returned to later. In this Ibiza carrier bag, found by police in Lucy Letby's bedroom, were a number of hospital shift handover sheets from 2016, a month where she murdered 2 children and tried to kill 1 other. In this Morrison shopping bag, also recovered from her bedroom, police found 31 handover sheets and a blood gas reading for a child she'd attacked. Lucy Letby was released under investigation, whilst police continued their inquiries. Finally, after this arrest in July 2018, 2 years after the last murders, she was suspended from her job, with conditions not to enter the Countess of Chester Hospital or any other medical facility, unless it was a medical emergency. She was arrested again on the 10th of June 2019, and, after further questioning, again released. Lucy Letby's final arrest came on the 10th of November 2020, and, on the 11th of November 2020, she was charged with 8 counts of murder and 10 counts of attempted murder. She was remanded into custody to await her day in court. Lucy Letby pleaded not guilty to all charges, and so her trial began at Manchester Crown Court on the 10th of October 2022 before Mr Justice Goss, with it being expected to last 6 months, but in fact it lasted almost 9 months. The final set of charges related to the murder of 7 babies and the attempted murder of a further 10. The defence's strategy was to argue that all these incidents were as a result of, quote, massive failure of care in a busy hospital neonatal unit, far too great to blame on one person. However, the prosecution's case was extremely strong, including the fact that Letby had been on shift during each incident. She was physically seen in the area or in the room of the children immediately after they deteriorated, her odd behaviour around the children's families, and her searching for them on Facebook. However, one of the most damning pieces of evidence was a note that police recovered from Letby's home, which read, quote, "There are no words. I'm an awful person. I pay every day for that. No hope. I can't breathe. I can't focus. I'll never have children or marry. I'll never know what it's like to have a family. Kill myself right now. Overwhelming fear. Haven't done anything wrong. Police investigation. Forget. Slander, discrimination, victimization. Despair, panic, fear. Lost, hate. Hate myself so much. All getting too much. Everything taking over my life. I feel very alone and scared. What does the future hold? How can I get through it? How will things ever be like they were? They won't. I don't deserve to live. I did this. Why me? I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough to care for them, and I am a horrible and evil person. I don't deserve Mum and Dad. The world is better off without me. I'm evil. I did this. In court, Letby claimed, when she gave evidence, that she wrote this because, quote, I felt at the time that if I'd done something wrong, I must be such an evil, awful person. I'd somehow been incompetent and had done something wrong which had affected those babies. So what I think she's saying is that she didn't actually kill them, but she believed that something she had done led to their deaths. Right, that's not how it reads. Letby was asked about the documents in her property, and she denied that they were, quote, souvenirs to remind her of her crimes. The jury began their deliberation on the 10th of July 2023, and on the 18th of August 2023, it was reported that Lucy Letby had been found guilty of the murders of 7 babies and the attempted murder of 6 others. Her sentencing hearing was scheduled for the 21st of August 2023. It should be noted that whilst the newspapers reported Lucy Letby's convictions on the 18th of August 2023, the verdicts had actually been read out over several hearings, I believe 3, in the days before this reporting. Letby was present during the first hearing, but refused to attend the rest. This cowardice extended to her sentencing. She refused to stand before Mr. Justice Goss to receive her punishment, her final act of defiance. There appeared to be plans to ensure that criminals of force would be at their sentencing, but, for the time being, there was nothing that could be done. However, in contrast to this thing's utter cowardice, many of the brave parents of the children she murdered and attempted to murder were in court, and some provided or read out victim impact statements, which are simply heartbreaking. This included a statement which read out on behalf of the father of baby G, who Letby tried to kill. She outlined how she'd been left severely disabled as a result of the attacks. She's registered blind, has cerebral palsy and scoliosis. She's in desperate need of spinal operations, but due to her vulnerabilities, she may not survive the surgery. Her father added, quote, what if she outlives us? Who will care for her then? Her condition affects every aspect of our lives. We see other families and their children fishing, playing football, other things we can't do. She'll never have a sleepover, go to high school, have a boyfriend, get married. Baby I's mother stated, quote, on the night Baby I died, we were speaking with the nurses in room 1, and they said at the rate she was improving, there was still a chance she could be home for Christmas. When they handed Baby I to us, we never wanted to let her go. We held her so tight. She was a gorgeous little princess, and I can't even begin to explain the pain when we lost her. A part of us died with her. The father of babies O and P, the twins Letby murdered, there were 2 of triplets, described the moment his first son died, with him saying, quote, I noticed the colour of baby O's skin was changing rapidly. It didn't appear normal to the naked eye. It was horrific to see, and it's an image I'll never forget. Deep down, I knew it wasn't going to end well. Baby O received a blessing from the priest and was quickly christened. Moments later, he was gone. I felt like I'd been stabbed in the heart. No words could describe how I was feeling. I kept wishing it had happened to me, and at that time would have gladly taken his place. These statements highlight front and centre not only the devastation that Letby caused, but the bravery of these parents to get up and keep going. And I'm sure all they want to do is curl up into a ball, fade away, and be with their children again. I hope with all my heart those who were taken are safe, loved and protected. Those who have survived, I've no doubt their loving parents would give them the best quality of life they're able to, because they, unlike Lucy Letby, would give their lives for their children. Due to the cowardice of Letby, Justice Goss made his sentencing remarks and passed his sentence, speaking to an empty dock. The sentencing hearing was filmed. I'll include a small part of it, but we'll leave a link to the full thing in the description.
This was a cruel, calculated and cynical campaign of child murder involving the smallest and most vulnerable of children, knowing that your actions were causing significant physical suffering and would cause untold mental suffering. You created situations so that collapses or causes of collapses would not be obvious or associated with you. You removed and retained confidential records of events relating to your crimes and checked up on bereaved parents. There was a deep malevolence bordering on sadism in your actions. During the course of this trial, you have coldly denied any responsibility for your wrongdoing and sought to attribute some fault to others. You have no remorse. There are no mitigating factors. In their totality, the offences of murder and attempted murder were of exceptionally high seriousness, and just punishment, according to law, requires a whole life order. Lucy Letby, on each of the 7 offences of murder and the 7 offences of attempted murder, I sentence you to imprisonment for life. Because the seriousness of your offences is exceptionally high, I direct that the early release provisions do not apply. The order of the court, therefore, is a whole life order on each and every offence, and you will spend the rest of your life in prison.
So Lucy Letby has been sentenced to a whole life order, meaning that she will never be released from prison. She's one of only 3 women in the UK prison system who are guaranteed to die behind bars, including Rose West and Joanna Dennehy. All 3 deserve their fates. Lucy Letby should be counting her blessings. She's been allowed to live, when she took this choice away from so many. If she had committed these crimes in the death penalty state in the US, no doubt she'd be spending the rest of her days on death row, waiting for a date with the executioner. Imagine that some people, despite her committing these crimes in the UK, where there is no death penalty, believe she should have suffered the same fate. Public inquiries about the crimes of Lucy Letby are already planned, and these will focus on whether she could have been stopped sooner. However, even at this early stage, it appears that warnings were ignored, which could have saved the lives of at least some of her victims. These stem from concerns raised by staff in October 2015 and early 2016. A going to play a clip from interview Dr. John Gibbs, the consultant paediatrician on the neonatal unit, who discusses concerns about Letby that are ignored in early 2016.
It was the unusual nature of their collapses, the way they didn't respond as we'd expect to resuscitation, and for some of them, some unusual features such as strange rashes. And when this kept happening, then we became very worried something abnormal, something that couldn't be medically explained was happening.
At what point did you start to think what at that time must have been unthinkable?
Well, I think we all got extremely worried, us paediatricians. I got very worried by June 2016 because we'd had this review of some of the deaths in February 2016, which had shown that a number of them were unusual, unexpected, and had revealed that Lucy Letby was associated with all of those cases. And then in June 2016, there were several deaths in very quick succession of babies that we really, similar to some of the other babies, were doing very well. That the risk of them dying was small. We were expecting them to go home, and suddenly, one after another, they died. And that really worried us. And at that point, we felt something drastic had to be done to protect the babies on the unit.
It sounds like it was horrific being there, to be blunt.
Well, it's horrific whenever babies die in the neonatal unit. It's devastating for the parents. The fact we'd seen this many times over the previous year, far more than any of the 20-odd years that I'd been working there before, was a big worry, yes.
Did it reach a point where, when an alarm went off, you were instantly worried that the same thing would be happening again?
Probably only by late 2016, by June certainly, when I went to the neonatal unit around that time for yet another collapse. I did feel, oh no, not another one.
And also I imagine you would get there and realise that Lucy Letby was in the area where this was happening as well.
Yes, and towards the end of that year, one's heart would sink when we saw Lucy Letby there again, yes.
And at that point, it sounds like your concern wasn't that she wasn't up to the job or that she wasn't a competent nurse. The concern was that she was deliberately harming babies.
Our worry was that she might be doing that because we couldn't understand why these babies, quite a few of them, were collapsing, why some of them were dying.
You and your colleagues started raising your concerns, didn't you?
Yes, they were raised at various intervals, yes, but particularly from February 2016, concerns were being raised and fed up to the senior managers.
Why did it then take so long for the police to be called in?
Well, I think there was resistance on the senior management side to involving the police, but I don't know quite why, and really the senior managers ought to be asked, because I think they were receiving advice from different sources. We paediatricians were certainly concerned that someone, and suspicions fell on Lucy Letby, could have been harming and perhaps killing patients on the unit. The managers, they have to answer for themselves. I think they were receiving advice or information, opinions from various sources. If they just listened to us hospital paediatricians, I think the police would have been called in a lot earlier.
So it appears that senior management within the hospital have a lot of questions to answer. It doesn't appear that Dr. Gibbs was the only doctor who raised concerns, and the hospital's top manager apparently demanded that the doctors who raised the alert write letters of apology to Letby for the stress caused by questioning her actions. When Letby was eventually taken off the front line in June 2016 and put on clerical duties, this was apparently only after resistance from senior management. Also, she was based in an office with access to sensitive information in close proximity to senior managers who were investigating her, so clearly she could try and influence them. And if she heard something that may have been incriminating towards her, she had the opportunity to cover her tracks. I imagine that the story of the role the hospital had in allowing Letby to continue killing and attempting to kill innocent newborns will be truly shocking. There must be accountability when this is known. No hiding, no whitewashing. The public deserves the truth, and to know that something has been done to send a very clear message across the NHS, but more importantly to the patients and their families, so that they know that when they go into hospital, their safety and care is the primary concern, although that doesn't seem to have been true in this case. Lucy Letby has now been confirmed as a serial killer and the UK's most prolific killer of babies in modern times. She is a truly horrific individual who abused her position of trust so utterly to take away the lives of innocent, sick children who had no way of defending themselves or calling for help. This is nothing to say of the horror the family suffered, knowing that someone who they put their complete trust in was so sadistic and so evil. Just saying what this woman did is horrifying enough. Lucy Letby murdered 7 babies and tried to kill 6 others. However, the details which are presented in this video are even more heinous. She killed babies who were only hours old, committed attacks within hours of each other, killed siblings, repeatedly tried to kill some of the babies over and over again, gave the grieving parents no peace, and has shown no remorse of any kind about anything she's done. Lucy Letby will spend the rest of her life in prison, but the question still remains why she did it. The truth is we don't know, and will likely never fully know. Letby has no vested interest in admitting her crimes. Her denial is probably the only thing she has left, and no doubt she'll appeal the convictions, and when this is unsuccessful, her length of sentence, both of which I have no doubt will be denied. We do have a similar case to draw on, and that's the case of Beverly Allett, who, whilst working as a nurse in the Grantham and Kesteven Hospital in Lincolnshire, murdered 4 children, attempted to murder 3 more, and caused grievous bodily harm to a further 6 between February and April 1991. Why Allett committed her crimes has never been definitively identified. She's never admitted them, but it's believed that she suffered from 2 conditions: Munchausen syndrome and Munchausen syndrome by proxy. These are both rare psychological disorders where a person's main aim is to gain attention, with the former resulting from the sufferer pretending to be ill or deliberately producing symptoms of illness in themselves, and the latter being doing this for a third party. An example of Munchausen's by proxy
would be a woman who deliberately makes her child ill in order to gain attention from medical professionals. The reason why Alice is believed to have suffered from both conditions is that she was known to feign injuries, with her wearing bandages and casts over fictitious injuries, and she spent significant amounts of time attending hospitals as a teenager, with reports of medical ailments which had no basis in reality. She also had a disturbing history of psychological problems. While trying to be a nurse, she smeared feces on the walls in a nursing home where she trained, and apparently also put this in the refrigerator for others to find. Her boyfriend at the time said later she was aggressive, manipulative, and deceptive, claiming false pregnancies as well as rapes before the end of the relationship. How with this profile she became a nurse is beyond me, but she did, and it's believed that when her own fictitious injuries didn't get her the attention she needed, she began to murder and harm children in her care. On one occasion, she was held for saving a child's life, with the staff not realising that she was the one who injected air into their bloodstream, which was her preferred method of attack, followed by an overdose of insulin, exactly like Lucy Letby. However, there are differences in these two cases. There's currently no real evidence that Lucy Letby displays traits of Munchausen syndrome. I think potentially there are some indicators of Munchausen's by proxy. She does appear to have tried to use some of the deaths of the children to get reassurance from colleagues and attention. Like Alet, she was praised for saving the life of a child she herself had tried to murder. In addition, it's mentioned that she was infatuated with the doctor in the hospital, and on at least one occasion, she went to him to get help with the children that she'd harmed. So potentially her behaviour was also to get his attention. However, whilst I think this was part of her thinking, I believe it was a far less significant factor in this case compared to that of Beverly Alet, and that Lucy Letby's motivations and underlying issues are far more sinister and infinitely more dangerous. Specifically, I think that Lucy Letby is a psychopath, a narcissist, and a sadist. With regards to narcissism, I know that this personality disorder is complex, with different subcategories, but to simplify, the core of most narcissists is low self-esteem and often self-loathing and self-hatred. They spend their entire lives hiding behind a false identity that portrays them as charming, charismatic, confident, articulate, successful, and unique. Maintaining this facade is everything to the narcissist, and they crave what is known as narcissistic supply, other people giving them validation, admiration, reassurance, power, and control. This enables them to continue to craft a perception that, rather than the insecure person they are in fact superior and worthy of special treatment. This does make sense if you think about it. If you're trying to get as far away from feelings of yourself that you hate, you would convince yourself of the polar opposite. So it goes from I am inferior and unintelligent to I am actually superior and a genius. As time progresses, they can start to fully believe their delusional thinking. If an incident occurs which pierces this shell and hits at the very core of the narcissist, they suffer a narcissistic injury where they experience the emotions they're so desperately trying to avoid. So for example, feelings of incompetence or unworthiness. In response, they go into what is known as the narcissistic rage, a response where they seek to get revenge against whoever or whatever has caused them to feel this way, and also as a way to reinforce to others the facade they're so desperate to project. Reflecting this onto Letby, I believe that at her core is likely cripplingly low self-esteem and self-loathing, with a significant part of this being that she wasn't sure she was actually capable of being a nurse, something she'd wanted to be since she was a child. As a shield to this, over the years, she created this perception that she was in fact superior to others, worthy of special attention and recognition. The fact she'd been in the papers for various things as part of her role likely fell into this, and I imagine she considered herself an amazing nurse, the best on the unit. I firmly believe that something happened in 2015 which shattered this, a major event, at least to her anyway, or a sequence of events which led Letby to suffer a narcissistic injury. I think this likely has something to do with the hospital. Potentially she felt she wasn't getting special treatment. Maybe she was denied a promotion. It could have been any number of things. As a response, she hit at the very heart of the establishment, harming children on the ward as a way to bring the unit into disrepute, to punish the management or other staff for how they made her feel. Also, I think the crimes enabled her to reaffirm to herself how special she was. She was getting away with murder in plain sight, and I've no doubt this made her feel very clever, watching the chaos unfold and knowing she was the cause. And as she kept getting away with it, her feelings of superiority must have grown. This, in my opinion, would actually explain the note that she wrote, where she used the sentence, quote, "I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough to care for them, and I am a horrible and evil person." She killed them because at her core, she didn't feel good enough. And when she was reminded of this, she responded by murdering and attempting to murder the children. Lucy Letby's clear narcissism is shown by other factors as well. Referring back to this note, despite her having killed 7 children, it's entirely self-centered. It's all about her. How will I get through this? I won't have a family. There's not a single word about anyone else but herself. Also, it's shown by her behaviour in court, specifically her lack of emotion when the details of the baby she murdered were read out in court. But when a doctor she knew, I believe the one she had feelings for, gave evidence, she began to cry. Letby couldn't care less about the children she murdered, but when someone she knew was standing up and telling the world about what she was really like, she couldn't handle it. She cried out of self-pity as her carefully crafted facade was being shattered. Her crimes themselves, and these last 2 points, I think are also clear evidence of her psychopathy. She has no remorse, no guilt, no empathy for what she has done. The only thing she cares about is how it's impacted her life. The last element, I believe, is sadism, which is intrinsically linked to the issue of narcissism and psychopathy. Specifically, I've no doubt that Letby felt extremely powerful seeing the direct results of her crimes. She couldn't help but go into a room with a grieving mother, bathing her dead baby, in order to gloat and brag with a smile planted all over her face. She wanted to see what she had done. She wanted to see the pain in the mother's eyes. She likely felt a massive thrill knowing that this mother was looking at the woman who'd killed her child, and she didn't know. Her checking on Facebook was again her looking for signs of the chaos she'd caused. She even looked at the grieving parents' details on Christmas Day. I've no doubt this sick, twisted woman, as part of her Christmas celebrations and a present to herself, was desperately hoping to see some tragic post about the parents' despair that their child or children were not there for their first Christmas. Again, I'm sure she would have been sat there, beaming, knowing she caused this. Also, she would have likely shuffled through the paperwork she'd taken from the hospital, her trophies, reliving her crimes. This all fed into her narcissism. I did these things, and no one knows. I am a genius. These are just my thoughts working on basic information. As the weeks, months and years progress, more details about Letby will likely be published, giving flesh to the bones of any psychological assessment of her. However, I think there's a strong possibility that whatever initially triggered Lucy Letby's crimes, by the end, she potentially just liked killing and was addicted to whatever this act gave her. In several of her notes found in her property, the phrase, quote, "Please help me" is used. I interpret that as her stating, "Someone needs to stop me, as I can't stop killing." No doubt if she hadn't been caught, Lucy Letby would potentially have killed hundreds. The scary thing in this case is that even with every scrap of forensic information and a detailed profile of Letby's life, we may still never know exactly why she did what she did. As I said, she's unlikely to ever tell us, and will likely deny her crimes until her dying day. As I said, a serious case review, or several, will be completed, and I'd be surprised if there were not previous concerns about Letby, with her potentially injuring other children in various ways, whilst also in a narcissistic rage, but not going as far as killing them. I'd be extremely surprised if she simply began killing children one day, without any build-up. Letby did work shifts in other hospitals, and I think further crimes linked to her may be revealed in the future. Potentially what we currently know is just the tip of the iceberg. However, regardless of the fact that not all the puzzle pieces are present, I don't think it could be questioned that Lucy Letby is an extremely dangerous woman who caused untold misery to so many families, and whose crimes are some of the most heinous that the UK has ever seen. She deserves to spend the rest of her life shut away from society. Stephen Pauls is a British serial killer and serial rapist who murdered a minimum of 4 men between 2014 and 2015. However, he is known to have begun drugging and raping men from at least 2012. He met all of his victims through online dating applications, leading to him being dubbed the Grinder Killer. There are 2 sides to this story. First, the horrific crimes report, but also the inaction of the police, which meant that the victims' families were not taken seriously, and they suffered further pain outside of losing loved ones. Paul was also free to kill and kill again. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Stephen Port was born on the 22nd of February 1975 in Southend, in the county of Essex, to Joan and Albert Port. He also had an older sister, Sharon. There's little information about Port's early upbringing, but no indications of abuse, although it's stated that his father had an issue with homosexuality, and therefore Port kept his attraction to males secret from his parents. Growing up, Port was described as being extremely isolated and considered strange by his classmates, and he was frequently bullied. One of his classmates described her interactions with Port, stating, quote, "He was quiet, shy and a loner, who sat on his own in class. The other class members were really not nice to him, and sometimes you could see the hurt on his face when they were really nasty. I was the only one that really talked to him because it wasn't right how he was treated. I told him to ignore them. We weren't really friends, as I myself found him a bit odd." After leaving school at the age of 16, Port went to art college, but it proved too expensive for his parents, and he spent 2 years training as a chef instead. Port was described as a strange man, and, despite his 6'5" frame, was extremely childlike, and even in adulthood was immature and liked to play with children's toys. Port lived at home with his parents until his early 30s, but in 2006 moved into his own property, 62 Cook Street in Barking, East London, where he committed his offences and will remain until his arrest years later. It's clear that Stephen Port struggled in the real world due to his awkwardness and general lack of social skills. However, on the internet, he could portray himself as anything he wanted to be and would spend all day, every day online, rarely leaving his flat. On the internet, he claimed to have been a graduate of Oxford University, served in the armed forces, and worked as a special needs teacher in London. None of this was true. It said Port worked for 13 years as a chef at West Ham Bus Depot and also did other work, such as door-to-door sales. Similarly, as opposed to being a balding man in his 30s, Port would post numerous pictures wearing a wig, clearly trying to make himself more attractive to other men, but also making himself look younger. As an aside, the television show Celebrity MasterChef had an episode filmed in West Ham bus station, and Stephen Port appears in the background, albeit briefly. This episode aired in mid-2014, so it was likely filmed earlier that year, or potentially in 2013, so before he committed the murders. However, by this point, he was already a rapist, and it must have been strange for everyone involved in this episode, knowing that they were standing mere feet away from a future serial killer. Anyway, it's clear that Port was a man obsessed with sex, specifically with younger men, and at an inquest for one of his victims, it was revealed that he'd sent hundreds of thousands of messages to men on applications such as Grindr, and his neighbours noticed a revolving door of young-looking men going into his apartment. It got to the point where, due to how young the men looked, his neighbours were concerned Port was a paedophile. Port would also use drugs as part of his sexual activities with these men, specifically GHB, the drug originally developed as an anaesthetic, sometimes known simply as G. It's known to reduce inhibitions, increase libido, and sexual sensations become much more intense. It's commonly known as a, quote, date rape drug, due to its ability to cause unconsciousness and memory loss, and also because it's an odourless, colourless liquid that can be easily put in someone's drink without them noticing. However, it's also a highly dangerous drug, and in high enough doses can cause coma or even death. Also found on Port's laptop was obsessive viewing of, quote, date rape pornography, where he would watch scenarios, likely simulated, but potentially not, where men had sex with other men whilst one of them was unconscious. Port would watch hours of this material each and every day. It's clear that Port began to want to replicate this behaviour, and, by 2012, had put his plan into action. It's not clear how many men Stephen Port actually raped, but, in court, the earliest victim he was known to have attacked was a 19-year-old university student who Port met on Grindr in 2012. The pair chatted, and this male went to Port's flat, describing as being, quote, polite and friendly, and that, quote, nothing rang alarm bells. He was then given a glass of wine and noticed congealed powder in the bottom of the glass and immediately believed he'd been spiked. He then became dizzy and disorientated before losing consciousness. He had a vague recollection of being taken into the bedroom, undressed and raped by Port, but was unable to wake himself or fight back. This male was allowed to live and quickly left the property. It appears he was unsure whether what had happened was real or imagined, but when he got to university, he sought medical advice as he believed he'd been drugged. In January 2013, a man called the police and made an allegation that he'd been raped by Port on New Year's Eve 2012 and that he'd done this on several occasions before that. This male said that Port had plied him with drugs and alcohol to the point he was so under the influence he couldn't say no or fight back, and on each occasion, Port had anally raped him. It doesn't appear that Port was arrested for this allegation, and nothing came of it, although an entry was put on the police national computer database. The next victim was a male known only as B in court records. B was aged 20 when he met Stephen Port on a dating site for gay men. B went to Port's flat in Barking in June 2014 and stated that Port seemed, quote, a very nice guy. B was offered a drink and almost immediately fell unconscious. When he woke up, he was terrified and began shouting and screaming for help. Port, rather than calling an ambulance, supported B whilst walking to Barking train station. B was in a terrible state, vomiting profusely and hardly able to stand. When they got to the station, they were seen by officers from the British Transport Police who saw B incoherent, distressed and vomiting. Port told them that everything was okay and that B had just taken GHB. In court, it couldn't be proven that Port had actually raped B. However, even if this didn't occur, it was clearly the intention. In amongst the crimes against these two men, Port also repeatedly drugged and raped a male known only as C. A couple of things can be taken from this. Firstly, it's clear that Port was drugging men at least 2 years before he began committing the murders, with the intention of raping these individuals. This makes me certain he must have raped far more men than we know about, as it's unlikely that a man this obsessed with sex and heavily invested in date rape porn would have such large gaps between his offences. Unfortunately, there were likely significant issues of shame with these victims, who likely could not recall their attacks and potentially convinced themselves that any physical injury they suffered was as a result of consensual sexual activity they could not remember. Others may have felt they could not report it for other reasons, i.e. already being in a relationship, or potentially they felt the police wouldn't take them seriously, which unfortunately, given what happened after this point, seems to be a concern well founded. Secondly, the first victim referred to seeing powder in his drink. I think that Port was experimenting with different drugs for years to determine which would be the most effective at disabling his victims. GHB is a white crystalline powder in its raw form, but it's never normally solved this way. Instead, it's mixed with water to create a liquid solution. So whatever you put in the first victim's drink was something else. I think he then switched to GHB because it's harder to detect and potentially much more effective. Lastly, I think that Port saw the attack on B as a mistake, and that due to his screaming and crying out for help, he was forced to accompany him to the train station, and there he came across the police. I think that Port saw this as a close call, and he believed he needed to ensure this would never happen again. He needed to make sure his victims were completely under his control, with no chance of escaping, and he could not risk being caught again walking the streets with someone he'd just drugged. So Port decided that these men would not leave his flat alive. Within days of the incident with B, Port was again on the prowl, and over the next year, he engaged in a campaign of rape and murder driven by his deviant and predatory sexual appetites. Stephen Port's first confirmed murder victim was 23-year-old Anthony Walgate. It wasn't pronounced Anthony. Anthony was 23 years old and originally from Hull, a city in East Yorkshire, but he moved down to London in order to attend fashion college. He was the son of a woman called Sarah Sack, a woman whose grit and determination is central to the eventual downfall of Stephen Port. Unfortunately, Anthony was struggling financially
and so turned to escorting to make money. On the 17th of June 2014, he was contacted by Stephen Port, who arranged sexual services in exchange for payment of £800. It should be noted that Port had no personal savings, and therefore he clearly had no intention of paying Anthony. Anthony travelled to Barking Station, where the pair met at approximately 10:15 p.m, and then went back to Port's flat. What happened next is known only to Port, but it's clear that soon after arriving, Anthony was given a fatal dose of GHB, likely in the laced drink, and he fell unconscious. Whether Port raped him whilst he was alive, dying, or indeed dead is unclear. The next day, Port stayed in the flat with Anthony's body and then went to work a late shift. He returned at 4 a.m. on the 19th of June 2014 and, after dressing Anthony's body, dragged him outside, propping him up by a wall right next to the entrance to the flat complex. Port took Anthony's mobile phone so that their communications could not be seen, plunged a small bottle of GHB on his body, and then made the following anonymous 999 call.
Emergency ambulance. What's the address of the emergency?
It's Cook Street. There's a young boy. Looks like he's collapsed outside. I don't know.
Outside of which number?
4758.
Sorry?
4758, I think.
47 Cook Street.
Yeah.
What area?
Barking. He looks like he's collapsed or had a seizure or something. He's just always just drunk. But, yeah.
What's the telephone number you're calling from?
I'm just pulled up in the car. I've got to get my car on the parking.
That's right, don't worry about that. What's the telephone number you're calling from?
Just before 8 a.m. on the 19th of June 2014, paramedics and the police attended, and it was clear that Anthony was dead. Suspicions were raised almost immediately, as Anthony was in a sitting position cross-legged, with the paramedics who attended believing that if he'd have simply died from a seizure, he would not have been sat bolt upright. He would likely have slumped over. Also, it was clear that Anthony had been dead for some time. It appeared clear that he died somewhere else, been moved, and then posed. In addition, whilst a small detail, Anthony's underwear was on back to front, which his friends said was never something he would do due to being fashion conscious. At a later inquest, it appears the paramedics did raise their suspicions with the police, but nothing was acted upon. An autopsy showed that Anthony had died from a drug overdose. Sarah Sack was on holiday in Turkey when her son died, and she rushed back to the UK when she heard the news. Her contact with the police was appalling, with the initial phone call telling her son had died apparently lasting only a few minutes, and it was clear there was no investigation into her son's death. The family liaison officer assigned to her had apparently written that Anthony liked to drink and had, quote, dabbled in drugs, specifically cocaine, something Sarah vehemently denied later. Sarah battled the police for months, insisting that her son was murdered, as she criticised the behaviour of the Metropolitan Police in London. Port did eventually fall on the police's radar, as, although he'd taken Anthony's mobile, they were able to trace the number of the phone that made their 999 call. Also, Anthony had told a friend where he was going and who he was meeting. This led to Stephen Port being arrested on the 26th of June 2014. At this point, Port's story magically changed. Anthony had been in his property and they had arranged money for sex, but Anthony had then taken GHB in front of him and died. Port said, due to panicking, he dragged him outside, propped him up, and then called 999. Alarm bells should have been ringing. Port was clearly lying to the police on at least one occasion. Also was the fact that Anthony had been dead for some time when he was found. He also had no history of using GHB, and if anyone had bothered to look into Port, they would have seen an allegation of rape against a male using drugs in 2012. However, none of this was done, and Port was only charged with perverting the course of justice due to making false reports to the police, and he was released on bail. Another major mistake was the police seized Port's laptop, but it was not examined for 10 months. If it had been checked before, they would have found multiple searches for date rape porn. Within 5 weeks,
and while still on bail, Port committed his second murder. Gabriel Kovari was aged 22 and born in Slovakia, but moved to the UK in June 2014 for a better life and was hoping to work for the NHS as a translator. Despite only being in the UK for less than 2 months, Gabriel saw the best and unfortunately the worst in people. He recently met a man called John Pape in July 2014. The pair developed a friendship as opposed to a relationship, and Gabriel moved in with him. Although their friendship only lasted 6 weeks, the pair became close. John was upset when on the 23rd of August 2014, Gabriel moved out, having told him he'd met a man online who'd offered him a place to stay. This man was Stephen Port. It's clear that Port had sexual intentions towards Gabriel as soon as he moved in, with him sending a text to a neighbour telling him he should come round and meet, quote, his new Slovakian twink flatmate, and that he was, quote, taking good care of him, suggesting there was more than just friendship going on between the pair. However, it appears that Gabriel soon regressed his decision, as he was not attracted to Port and had been sleeping on the sofa, but knew that Port would try to get him into bed. Sometime after 5 a.m, on the 25th of August 2014, Stephen Port administered a fatal dose of GHB in order to rape Gabriel. Port then took to covering his tracks, including using a false identity online, contacting Gabriel's friends, telling them that Gabriel had left the country. By chance, later in the day on the 25th of August 2014, Port's sister rang and later stated in court that her brother was distressed because there was a dead young man in his room. Port, the pathological liar that he appears to have been, later stated in court that the dead young man that he referred to in the conversation with his sister was Anthony Walgate, who had died over a month before, and that he was apparently having some sort of flashback. Absolute bollocks. Gabriel's body remained in the flat for some time, clearly whilst Port tried to figure out his next move. In the early hours of the 28th of August 2014, Port transported Gabriel's body, lightly wrapped in a bed sheet, to St Margaret's churchyard, approximately 500 metres away from his home. He then placed Gabriel against a wall in a sitting position. Port posed him, placing a pair of sunglasses on his face so someone who saw him at a distance would think he was just asleep. At around 6 a.m. that day, so a few hours later, a woman called Barbara Denham was walking her dogs past a graveyard where she saw a young man sat up against a wall who she thought was asleep. She called out, but there was no response. She then went up to him and touched him, and concerned that he may have been dead, called the police. Again, a bottle of GHB had been plastered on Gabriel's body. Police attended, and it was clear that Gabriel was dead. For some inexplicable reason, the death was determined to not be suspicious, with them assuming that Gabriel had accidentally taken a fatal dose of GHB and simply died where he was found. No post-mortem was conducted, and Gabriel's body was released to his family overseas for burial. John Pate was informed of the death of his friend and was in shock. He had no indication that Gabriel was a drug user, and he raised his concerns about the conclusions drawn by the police. He pointed out the similarities between the death of Gabriel and Anthony Walgate. Specifically, how strange it was that two young men should die of an overdose of the same drug within 500 metres of each other in less than 2 months. The police ignored his concerns. The police also stonewalled Sarah Sack, who was still trying to be heard about her son. She too had heard about the death of Gabriel and was convinced that there was a link to her son's death. Of course, she was correct. But she was ignored. So Stephen Port was in the clear and free to kill again and to claim his third victim. Daniel Whitworth was a 23-year-old chef who had his whole life ahead of him. He lived with his partner, but unfortunately was also using dating websites for gay men. And on the 18th of September 2014, he travelled to Barking train station and met with Port, and the pair went back to his flat. Sometime over the next few hours, Daniel was administered with a fatal dose of GHB and raped. Whilst Daniel lay dead in the property, Port began to cover his tracks. He deleted his dating profile and wrote an apparent suicide note, which he then planted on Daniel's body before, under the cover of darkness on the evening of the 19th of September 2014, he took Daniel's body to the same graveyard where he'd dumped Gabriel's remains. The next morning, a dog walker found his body. Not just any dog walker, Barbara Denham, the same woman who found the body of Gabriel a month before. She later reported her utter disbelief at being confronted by the same situation again. She approached Daniel's body, which was again propped up against the wall, touched his stomach, felt that he was cold, and then called the police for a second time, saying she'd found a body. The body of Daniel was literally 5 feet away from the spot where Gabriel's body had been found. Police attended and determined there was nothing that could be done for Daniel. Again, he was found with a bottle of GHB on him, but if they bothered to check, they would have found Port's DNA on his jacket from where he'd been redressed after being murdered. They also found an apparent suicide note, which read, quote, "I'm sorry everyone, mostly to my family, but I can't go on anymore. I took the life of my friend, Gabriel Klein. We was just having some fun at a mate's place, and I got carried away and gave him another shot of G. I didn't notice while we was having sex, he had stopped breathing. I tried to get him to start breathing again, but it was too late. It was an accident, but I blame myself for what happened. I didn't tell my family I went out. I know I would go to prison if I went to the police. I can't do that to my family, and at least this way, I can at least be with Gabriel again. I hope he will forgive me. By the way, please do not blame the guy I was with last night. We only had sex, then I left. He knows nothing of what I've done. I've taken what G I have left with sleeping pills, so if these kill me, it's what I deserve. Feeling dizzy now, as took 10 minutes ago, so hoping you understand my writing.
I dropped my phone on my way here, so it should be in the grass somewhere."
This whole situation, but especially the note, should have been a massive red flag. Firstly, you have 3 young men, all found dead within 500 meters of each other, 2 of them mere feet apart, in the space of 2 months. None of whom were known to be regular users of GHB. If proper checks had been done, they would have found it odd that Daniel apparently was so bereft at killing his good friend Gabriel that he got his surname wrong, calling him Klein instead of Kavari. Also, they would have found the whole situation very odd, considering that Daniel had never even met Gabriel, and there was no evidence they even knew of each other's existence. Also, what an oddly phrased suicide note, with the man apparently in the throes of grief and utter despair that he'd taken the life of his friend, but he takes time to mention the man he just had sex with and says not to blame him. Blame him for what? Why even mention that at all? Clearly mention of sexual activity between Gabriel and Daniel in this note was to make the police think that any evidence of this would be explained. In addition, if they'd bothered to check the phone records of Gabriel and Daniel, they would have seen they were nowhere near each other on the date that Gabriel died. Clearly, Stephen Port thought he was very clever, trying to pin Gabriel's murder on Daniel, but this note is amateur hour for the reasons I've mentioned, and this should have launched a major investigation due to the overwhelming evidence that a serial killer was operating in the area. But nothing happened. Sarah Sack was still fighting for justice for her son, but was also now fighting for the families of both Gabriel Kavari and Daniel Whitworth. The families united and continued to put pressure on the police to take things seriously and actually investigate crimes, but they were all ignored. However, there is shocking evidence of very underhanded tactics employed by the police. In particular, in the case of Daniel's death, police records claim that the handwriting in the suicide note was confirmed as being a match to Daniel by his family, something they stated never happened. So the police chalked his death up to a suicide and made no attempts to investigate further. Stephen Port apparently did not kill again for a year, but he continued to drug and rape other men. He attacked at least 3 men, known as males D, E, and F. Male D was extremely vulnerable. He met Port in January 2015 and had his drink spiked at his flat and was then raped. Port filmed the rape, then showed it to D, who was obviously horrified. At this point, there's a gap of a few months in Port's offending, but this is only because he finally went to court for perverting the court of justice related to the death of Anthony Walgate. On the 23rd of March 2015, Port was sent to prison for 8 months for this offence. The court had no idea the man they were sending down for this simple offence had killed at least 2 people and raped multiple men. Port was released on June the 4th, 2015, and within a month had attacked another man. This was E, who was 35 years old and who met Port on Grindr in July 2015. By this point, Port appears to have been experimenting with different ways to drug men, and so, when the pair were at his flat, Port used a syringe to inject drugs straight into the anus of E. E felt a burning, painful sensation and immediately knew something was wrong. He got up, dressed, and left. Male F was already known to Port, and they reconnected via Grindr in September 2015. Again, F went to his flat, but he made it clear he did not wish to do any drugs. Under the pretense of applying lubrication, Port again injected drugs directly into F's anus. He felt a burning sensation and started to feel lightheaded, but luckily did not fall unconscious and was able to escape. Why Port let these men live is unclear, but I think that even he knew that he got away with things up to this point and that he couldn't risk having another dead body on his hands. However, his murderous impulses took over and he would claim another victim soon afterwards. Jack Taylor was a 25-year-old man who lived with his parents in Dagenham and worked as a forklift driver. On the 12th of September 2015, Jack went out drinking with his friends. He then went home and accessed Grindr and began speaking to Port, and they agreed to meet at Barking train station. This haunting CCTV footage shows the pair meeting and walking back to Port's flat, essentially Jack's last walk. I don't know about you, but there's part of me that just wants to shout, telling Jack to stop and go home, however ridiculous that might sound. What happened in Port's flat will never be known for certainty, but it's clear that Jack was drugged and raped and was dead by 7:30 AM, so around 4 hours after meeting Port, as he then began covering his tracks, deleting the Grindr app from both his and Jack's phone in order to delete the messages. Jack's body remained in the flat the entire day of the 13th of September 2015, and when it got dark, Port again carried or dragged his body to the same graveyard where he disposed of his last 2 victims. He placed Jack's body propped against a wall, again just a few feet away from where he dumped Gabriel and Daniel, but this time on the opposite side of the wall. Port planted a bottle of GHB on Jack, as well as a syringe, and took his phone, dumping it. Jack's body was found by a passerby, this time not the same dog walker as before, and the police were called. Again, stunningly, they appeared to take the evidence at face value and determined that Jack had probably taken a fatal overdose, potentially accidentally. Case closed. Jack's family were informed of his passing and were adamant that something was wrong. They stated that Jack had aspirations of becoming a police officer and so was very firmly anti-drug. It got to the point where Jack's family were doing their own investigation, compiling their own handwritten evidence and sending it to the police. However, they, like Sarah Sack, who was still banging down every door and calling everyone she could were ignored, with the police stating there was no reason to link Jack's passing to any of the 3 previous deaths in the last 16 months. It appears that Stephen Port was caught by chance in the end. A detective reviewing the death of Anthony Walgate happened to see the CCTV footage of Jack Taylor walking from Barking train station with a male. When this detective looked at the footage, he realised the person walking with Jack was Stephen Port, a man who'd been involved in the case of Anthony. At this point, the pieces finally fell into place, with links being made with all the victims and Port, and his background was properly checked and the content of his laptop reviewed. A new team of investigators were assigned, and finally, on the 15th of October 2015, Stephen Port was arrested on suspicion of 4 counts of murder. He was interviewed the next day,
and whilst he didn't go no comment, he gave very little truthful information. I've included the full release clip of the interview, which is 11 minutes long, as I think it's fascinating, but also people who like analysing body language will have plenty of material. If you want to skip it, as I said, it's about 11 minutes long.
So did you have any involvement in the death of the male that we just spoke about a short while ago, Gabriel Cavari or Gabriel Klein?
No, I didn't.
So, were you involved in administering any drugs or poisons or noxious substances to him?
No, I don't administer drugs to anyone or give drugs to anyone. That's done at the party by someone else. The name I recognised when the party mentioned before was is normally at the parties and deals with administrating drugs.
Who's that, sorry?
Daniel. Recognised him. Sometimes he deals, he hands out the drugs to the guests.
Daniel, this is the male
yeah.
that we spoke of earlier.
So, it might not be the same guy, I really don't know, but it's the only Daniel I know. Oh. I mean, I've spoken to him a couple of times at the party. I don't remember his name. He does, like what I did, Scott would ask him to pick up guys, take them to the party, and he would stay, but he would stay and minister or do out hand out drugs, whatever, but I would leave or he would stay.
And did you go with Daniel to meet people?
No, I knew he was doing the same as I was, but I'd see him at the party and had a brief conversation with him about it, but I've never actually engaged with him outside of the place.
Outside of a party? And which parties were these?
Well, Scott calls the fat parties.
Scott's parties?
Yeah.
The fat party?
Fat party, F-R-A-T.
Frat parties. So when was the first occasion that you met the person that you're talking of, someone that you know as Daniel?
I think I saw him the first few occasions I was there. It was the first time I photographed for Scott and Daniel was there. So I don't even know if it is the same Daniel we're talking about, but he's the only Daniel I can recall as such. I think his name was Whitworth, it rings a bell, but...
You think his name was Whitworth?
Yeah. I mean, if he's tall, almost as tall as me, with brown hair, slim.
Might help if I show you a picture. I'll call this CRT. See, this is Jack Taylor. Do you recognise that man?
No, I just don't recognise him. No. I don't pay full attention to the guys' faces when I have paid attention to the parties. But I don't recognise his face.
So you don't recognise his face?
I do not know. No.
And I mean that's Jack Taylor. So you don't recognise?
No, I don't.
Jack Taylor.
No.
So, have you ever slept with this male?
No.
Had sexual intercourse with him?
He doesn't look like the type I would go with myself.
He's not the sort of person you'd go for?
No, I tend to more. It's more younger, drinky boys, more younger boys, but not. He looks older. He could be similar to the type I've taken to parties, but I don't recognise him as being one of them.
So you don't recognise him as being one of them?
No.
No. Okay. And Jack, again, was found dead. It was on the 14th of September 2015. Stephen, did you have any involvement in his death?
I did not know. No.
Did you kill Jack Taylor?
Did not know. No.
Did you administer any drugs or noxious substances to him?
I did not know.
With the intention of causing him harm?
No. No. Definitely not.
No. And you say you've never seen him before? Is that right?
That's right.
That's right. Okay, I've got another map here, CRT8. I'm just trying to show you as many maps of the area because it's not easy to get it all on one piece of paper, just so that we're clear really. And again, it shows your home address and it shows the church St Margaret, and behind it you've got the Abbey and the primary school. In particular, the area around the walls of the Abbey. Have you ever had any reason to go into that area?
No.
Have you ever been through into the Abbey?
No, I haven't. No. No, I don't generally go to the church areas. No. No. I think once went to that church with my ex-Danny. Went to the church on a Christmas day, and into the church. But that's as far as I got. As far as
You've not been into the grounds behind it, where you've got the old Abbey walls.
No, gosh.
The grounds there.
No, what's the spooky side? I won't go there.
You've never been in that.
No.
In all the 8 years that you've lived across the road from the park.
I thought it was all private. I wouldn't go there. I think it's a private area. It belongs to the church.
It's fairly open, isn't it, when you go past? Would you agree with that or not?
And the field's, the field is, but the church bit behind the walls, we'll go past there.
Because 3 of the 4 people that have been found dead were found slumped up against the wall here of the Abbey. Pardon?
Yeah, I didn't know that.
You didn't know that? So that's news to you, is it? Did you put them there?
No.
So obviously Anthony was found slumped outside your address with a large amount of GHB in his system. The other 3 men we've been discussing were all found over by the wall area of the abbey we can see on the map. Again, all of them were slumped against the wall with a large amount of GHB in their body. Can you account for that at all?
No, I can't.
I mean, Stephen, did you write this letter here, CRT 11?
No, I didn't.
The photos of it that's found with Daniel. Are you telling us the truth, Stephen?
I'm telling you the truth, yes.
About the letter?
Yes. 100% truth.
About all of these boys?
Yeah.
Young boys? In the early stages of their youth, really, in terms of in their early 20s. All found dead. Stephen?
Yeah, I understand, but...
Close to your house. One of them had been in your house, either just before or at the time when he died, and was found to have large quantities of a drug in his system. The other three were all found just over the road in the churchyard, or just beside the churchyard in that area that we've discussed, propped up against a wall, short distance from your house, all again with high levels of GHB in them, enough to kill them. Highly unusual way to die for one person. This is 4 all found very close to where you live. All men, young men, type of men that you say that you find attractive. All now dead, Stephen.
As it happened, Anthony, I know nothing about the other three, how they come to be.
Stephen, this is serious.
Yes, I know.
Okay. It's really important that you tell us the absolute truth.
Have you ever told yourself always true?
Stephen Port pleaded not guilty to all offences and, in October 2016, went on trial at the Old Bailey in London. Port tied himself in knots, and his claims changed rapidly, with him saying that he didn't know the victims, to admitting that he did, and then saying that they were in his flat and that apparently all of them had taken overdoses of GHB in front of him. The court did not believe him, and Stephen Port was found guilty of the murders of Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Cavari, Daniel Whitworth, and Jack Taylor. He was also found guilty of drugging with the intention of raping, or actually raping, 7 men between 2012 and 2015. On the 25th of November 2016, Stephen Port was set for sentencing before Mr. Justice Openshaw, who, whilst running through Port's long list of offences, stated, quote, "Self-evidently, the defendant is highly dangerous." He then sentenced him. Justice Openshaw stated, quote, "I had no doubt that the seriousness of the offending is so exceptionally high that the whole life order is justified. Indeed, it is required. The sentence therefore upon the counts of murder is a sentence of life imprisonment. A decline to set a minimum term. The result is a whole life sentence, and the defendant will die in prison. Therefore, Stephen Port joined the list of prisoners in the UK who will never be released. To this day, he continues to maintain his innocence for his offences." After Stephen Port was caught, and due in large part to the victims' families, the Metropolitan Police referred itself to the Independent Office for Police Conduct, the IOPC, and an investigation was launched. The police looked at the involvement of 17 officers involved in Stephen Port's case and found that 9 had demonstrated performance which had, quote, fallen below the standard required. They were reprimanded for, quote, performance failings, but allowed to remain in service. And, to add insult to injury, in 2021, the Metropolitan Police confirmed that 5 of these officers had been promoted. The coroner's inquest stated that inaction in the investigation of Anthony Walgate's death, quote, probably contributed to the deaths of the other 3 men. In June 2022, the IOPC stated they would be launching a fresh inquiry into the police's handling of the Stephen Port case, but given that the original investigation took 2 years, there'll be no answers quickly, and by the time a report is published, potentially these same officers will have been promoted again. I think the term probably is indicative of British culture, with us being very polite and not wishing to offend. I'll leave it to my viewers to determine what they think, but I would say the police failings definitely led to Port being allowed to kill and rape people after his first murder. All of the victims' families and friends accused Metropolitan Police of institutional homophobia. They also pointed out how inevitably the police would have handled this case differently if the 4 victims had been women. I think it's horrific that the family and friends of these young men had to basically put their grief aside in order to become detectives, because the people whose job it actually was to do this were so useless. Total respect then. So, what could be said about Stephen Port? What was the thinking of this serial murderer? I think that ultimately Port's behaviour was driven by inadequacy. He was a man who had poor social skills, a menial job, and, at quite a young age, was losing his hair. These are clearly things that Port wasn't able to come to terms with, so he had to project lies about success on the internet and walk around with a wig in order to project the man he wanted to be, not the person he was. The internet was his escape. On there, he could be anyone he wanted. He could feel a sense of belonging and acceptance, likely from the thousands of men he interacted with online. It's common for men and women who have significant issues with their self-esteem to use sex as a way to make themselves feel better temporarily. In these moments, they feel wanted, and temporarily they can forget about how they actually feel. Chasing this feeling can become addictive, and it's clear that this was the case with Stephen Port. While Stephen Port is known as the Grindr Killer, he used around 10 different dating websites and apps and was obsessed with filling his life with sexual encounters, which I think were an escape from his daily life. I think that Port being described as childlike is also a relevant part to understanding him. As a child, we are taught self-control and that we can't have everything we want. Port appears to have learnt neither of these things. However, I think that as time went on, this didn't have the same impact on Port. The high of meeting random men for sex was starting to wane. He needed to escalate his behaviour. Port became obsessed with rape pornography. I think watching this gave him an idea of how to use sex to have control over another human being, and he started to replicate what he'd seen. He also took people's lives, which was the ultimate demonstration of his power over them. I imagine that Port was most likely ecstatic going through the list of men online, thinking about who he could have sex with their level of consent meaning nothing. They were just objects to use and abuse. When he met them, it didn't matter that he had extremely poor social skills, or was very odd, or wore a wig. They wouldn't live long enough to mock him about these things. He was in complete control. Once he had finished with one victim, he dumped them like rubbish, before moving on and looking for more men to drug, rape, and murder. Watching footage of Stephen Port makes me realise just how good Stephen Merchant's performance was in the 2022 series called 4 Lives, which, if you can find it, is well worth a watch. I think it's still on BBC iPlayer. In my opinion, Stephen Merchant perfectly captures the strange, lumbering demeanour of Port, but also hints at something else, especially during the court scenes, extreme violence and anger. And I think deep within Port, despite his quiet and shy demeanour, is a core of anger and violent tendencies which he had no desire to control. Stephen Port is inevitably a psychopath, and, if released, I have no doubt he would keep killing. However, he'll never get the chance, as Stephen Port's life will end behind prison bars. So, what are your thoughts